Somewhere right now, someone is lying in the dark, eyes closed, listening to this sentence. And somewhere else, thousands of miles away, someone else is doing the exact same thing. That's the strange comfort of what we're about to explore tonight. Because this story isn't really about the past. It's about a question so big, so quiet, that most people never even think to ask it. What if this isn't the first time? What if human civilization, the one you're living in right now, with its cities and satellites and glowing screens, isn't the first version of us to reach this point? What if it's not even the second or the third? What if we are the seventh? Across dozens of ancient cultures, separated by oceans, mountains, entire epochs of time, the same strange number keeps appearing. 7. 7 suns, 7 ages, 7 worlds, each one born, each one flourishing, and each one ending. The Aztecs believed we live under the 5th sun, with 4 worlds destroyed before ours. Hindu texts describe cycles of time so vast they make human history look like a single breath, and some researchers, looking at all these traditions side by side, have started asking an uncomfortable question. What if these aren't just myths? What if they're memories? Tonight, we're going to slow down and drift through one of the strangest possibilities in human history. The idea that long before Egypt, before Sumer, before anything we call ancient, there may have been another civilization, advanced in ways we still don't fully understand, building something massive, something important, and then, suddenly, stopping, not fading slowly, not declining over centuries the way empires usually do. Stopping as if the lights simply went out. What were they building when it happened? Some point to structures scattered across the world that seem too precise, too advanced, too strange for the timelines we've been taught. Places like Göbekli Tepe, buried on purpose thousands of years before agriculture supposedly existed. Places like Baalbek, where stones larger than houses sit unfinished, as if the workers just walked away one afternoon and never came back. We're not here tonight to prove anything. This isn't a documentary, making bold claims. Think of it more like a slow walk through mystery, myth, and half-buried evidence, the kind of journey that's perfect for drifting off to sleep, because your mind can wander without ever needing to solve anything. There will be no jump scares here, no urgency, no flashing graphics. Just a calm unfolding of one of the oldest questions humans have ever asked. Have we been here before? Before we go further, I want to know something. Tell me in the comments what time it is right now where you are, and where in the world you're listening from. I love seeing these little snapshots roll in. Someone in Tokyo just waking up. Someone in Chicago finally closing their eyes. Someone in a small town in Portugal listening under blankets while rain taps the window. It's strangely beautiful, all of us scattered across the planet, drifting off to the same story at completely different moments. And if you'd rather listen without any music, without ads interrupting, right as your mind starts to settle, you can follow along on Spotify. The link is right there in the description. Just plain narration, calm and steady, all the way through. So get comfortable, settle in, because tonight we're going somewhere strange. Through lost cities swallowed by oceans, through myths that describe floods no one alive should remember, through ruins that seem to defy the timelines in our textbooks. We're going to ask what the 6th civilization might have been building in its final days, and whether the whispers left behind in stone and story were meant to reach us. Because if this really is the 7th world, then somewhere buried deep in myth and rock, there might be a warning written just for us. Let's slow down for a moment and sit with an idea that human beings have apparently never stopped thinking about, no matter where they lived or when they lived it. The idea that time itself moves in circles, Not a straight line from cave to city to spaceship, but a wheel, turning, bringing the same lessons back around again and again, dressed in different clothes, spoken in different languages, but somehow always telling the same story. This isn't a fringe idea whispered by a handful of eccentric thinkers. This is one of the most widespread beliefs in the history of our species. Cultures with no contact with each other, separated by mountain ranges and open ocean, thousands of years apart, all seem to have arrived at a strikingly similar conclusion. That the world we live in now is not the first world. That other worlds came before it. That those worlds ended. And that ours too will probably end someday, only for something new to rise in its place. Let's start in India, with a concept that stretches the human mind almost past its limits. The Yugas. According to ancient Hindu cosmology, time doesn't move forward forever. It moves in enormous cycles called Yugas, 4 great ages that repeat over and over, like the seasons of a year, except each season lasts for thousands upon thousands of years. There's the Satya Yuga, the age of truth, a golden era when humanity lived in near perfect harmony, when righteousness was said to stand on all 4 legs, strong and unshaken. Then comes the Treta Yuga, a slightly diminished age, where virtue starts to wobble, where 3 legs remain steady, but the 4th begins to falter. After that, the Dwapara Yuga, half light and half shadow, a world where good and evil exist in uneasy balance. And finally, the age we are told we're living in right now. The Kali Yuga, the age of conflict, the age of darkness, the age when truth stands on just one trembling leg, and everything else has crumbled beneath it. According to these ancient texts, the Kali Yuga is defined by exactly the kinds of things that might sound uncomfortably familiar. Growing selfishness, fractured relationships, environmental decline, a forgetting of deeper spiritual truths in favour of material obsession. And when this age finally reaches its lowest point, when things become as dark as they can possibly become, the cycle doesn't just continue. It resets. The world is destroyed or transformed or wiped clean, depending on which version of the story you read. And then, quietly, a new Satya Yuga begins, a new golden age, a new innocent world rising from the ashes of the old one. What's remarkable here isn't just the story itself, it's the scale. Some estimates place the full cycle of these 4 yugas at over 4 million years. Ancient thinkers weren't just imagining a few centuries of rise and fall. They were imagining something vast enough to make entire civilizations look like brief flickers of light in an unimaginably long night. If a version of humanity existed before us and was wiped away and we simply don't remember it, this way of thinking would have no trouble accepting that at all. It would almost expect it now. Let's drift west, across mountains and deserts, into the myths of ancient Greece, where a similar structure appears, though wrapped in different imagery. The poet Hesiod, writing sometime around the 7th century BCE, described 5 ages of man, and if you listen closely, you'll notice the same downward slope toward decay that we just heard echoing out of India. First came the Golden Age, a time when humans lived like minor gods. No labour, no suffering, no aging. The earth gave freely, and people lived in peace until they simply, gently died, as if falling asleep. Then came the Silver Age, a step downward. Still long-lived, still relatively innocent, but slower, weaker, more foolish than those who came before. After that, the Bronze Age arrived, and with it, violence. Hesiod describes these people as strong, but consumed by war, more interested in conflict than in wisdom, until eventually they destroyed themselves entirely. Then something curious happens in the pattern. A 4th age appears that breaks the steady decline. The Age of Heroes. Demigods and legendary warriors, the kind you'd recognize from the stories of Troy, brave but still doomed, most of them dying in great battles that echoed for generations afterward. And finally, the age Hesiod believed he himself was living in. The Iron Age, an age of exhaustion, of moral decay, of children disrespecting parents, of greed replacing honour, of gods slowly turning their faces away from humanity in disappointment. Hesiod wrote that in this age people would toil endlessly, suffer constantly, and find little relief, and that eventually this age too would end, likely in ruin, making space for whatever might come next. Notice the pattern: a shining beginning, a slow forgetting, a fall into violence, and finally collapse. It is in its structure almost identical to the Hindu Yugas, despite coming from a completely different part of the world, shaped by a completely different culture, with no clear connection between the two traditions. But the story doesn't stop in India or Greece. Let's cross an entire ocean now to Mesoamerica, where the Aztec people told a story that might be the most direct ancestor of the idea we're exploring tonight. The idea of the suns, according to Aztec belief. The world has been created and destroyed multiple times, each version referred to as a sun, and each one ending in a different kind of catastrophe. The first sun, sometimes called the Sun of Earth, ended when jaguars devoured the giants who lived upon it. The second sun ended in violent winds that transformed its people into monkeys, scattering them through howling storms. The third sun ended in a fire that rained down from the sky, consuming almost everything, with survivors turning into birds to escape the flames. The fourth sun ended in a devastating flood, one so complete that its people were transformed into fish, swimming through what had once been dry land. And now, according to Aztec belief, we are living beneath the fifth sun, a world created through sacrifice, watched carefully by gods who might someday decide to end this one too. 4 worlds gone, 4 different apocalypses, 4 different reasons everything fell apart. And every single time, something rose from the wreckage to try again. Here is where it becomes difficult to simply dismiss all of this as unrelated coincidence. Because notice what's happening across every single one of these traditions, from the riverbanks of India to the hills of ancient Greece to the highlands of Mexico. Each culture describes a world that begins in a kind of glowing perfection. Each culture describes that world slowly decaying, losing its balance, losing its wisdom, losing its harmony with whatever forces are believed to govern existence. And in every single case, that decay eventually reaches a breaking point. A flood, a fire, a war, total darkness. The world doesn't just fade quietly into a peaceful ending. It's destroyed, violently, completely. And then, and only then, does a new world begin. Some researchers who study comparative mythology point to this pattern and ask a very simple, very unsettling question. Why would so many unconnected cultures independently imagine the exact same basic structure? Why would civilizations with no shared language, no shared geography, no possible communication with each other, all land on the idea that our current world is not the first and won't be the last? Is it simply human imagination working in similar ways, because we all fear the same things, endings, chaos, judgment? Or is it possible, and this is where things get quietly chilling, that these stories are distorted memories, echoes passed down through countless generations, describing something that actually happened? A real collapse, a real ending, something so devastating that it had to be wrapped in myth just to survive being spoken aloud at all. We don't have to answer that question tonight. In fact, part of the comfort of exploring a mystery like this is that you're allowed to simply hold the question gently, without needing to resolve it before you drift off to sleep. But keep this pattern in your mind as we continue. because it's going to come back again and again throughout tonight's journey. Golden beginnings, slow decline, sudden catastrophe, quiet rebirth, over and over and over. If these ancient traditions are remembering something real, then somewhere in that long chain of rising and falling worlds, there should be a number. A count, a way of keeping track of exactly how many times this cycle has happened before. And as it turns out, when you start gathering these myths side by side, laying them out like pieces of some enormous, scattered puzzle, that number starts to appear again and again, whispered across cultures that never should have agreed on anything at all. Across the world, different traditions seem to be standing in front of the same cosmic staircase, counting the steps beneath their feet. But when they speak that number out loud, it doesn't always match. Some say there have been 4 worlds before ours. Some say 5. Some say we're in the 5th right now, others the 6th. And in a few more mysterious corners of human thought, there are people who look at everything around us and quietly insist, no, this is the 7th. Start again in Mesoamerica with the Aztec story we just visited. In most versions of their cosmology, we're living under the 5th sun. 4 worlds have come and gone. 4 complete cycles of creation and destruction, each one ending in some new disaster. Earthquakes, fire from the sky, raging winds, a world-drowning flood. If you're counting, that makes us the 5th try, the 5th experiment, the 5th draft of reality. But travel a little further back in time, and a little further south, and you find the Maya keeping their astonishingly precise calendars in the forests of Central America. Their surviving texts and inscriptions don't all agree on a simple, neatly packaged number of worlds. Instead, they talk in enormous cycles of time called bactons and pictons, gears within gears of repeating ages. Some interpretations of their mythology describe previous creations of humanity that were discarded or destroyed. People made of mud that dissolved. People made of wood that had no souls. Humanity itself as something the gods attempted, revised, and tried again. When modern writers line up the Aztec and Maya material side by side, they sometimes speak casually of 5 worlds in Mesoamerican thought. 5 ages, 5 creations, 5 suns. But if you listen carefully, the story underneath is less about a fixed number and more about an ongoing pattern. Attempt, failure, destruction, renewal. Move north into the deserts and mesas of what is now the southwestern United States, and you meet the Hopi, whose traditions preserve one of the clearest and most haunting versions of this idea. According to Hopi myth, the world has already passed through 3 great ages. The first world was destroyed by fire. The second world was destroyed by ice. The third world, the one just before ours, was destroyed by a flood. Each time, a small number of people were guided to safety by spiritual beings, emerging afterward into a new world through openings in the earth or the sky. We, the people alive today, are said to be living in the 4th world. In some Hopi teachings, there is a prophecy that this 4th world will also end in upheaval and purification, and that a 5th world will be born from its ruins. In other words, if you stand inside that tradition, and you look back, you see 3 previous worlds. If you look around, you're in the 4th. If you look ahead, you expect a 5th. Already, the count is different. The Aztecs say 5 suns, with our current one being the 5th. The Hopi say 4 worlds, with our current one being the 4th. Some versions of Hindu cosmology layer 4 yugas within a larger repeating cycle of creation and dissolution called a kalpa, in which universes themselves are born and die like breathing. Hesiod describes 5 ages of man ending in his age of iron. 5 here, 4 there, a golden beginning, a dark ending, but no single shared scorecard. And yet, as you move away from ancient myth and into more recent esoteric traditions, a new number begins to appear, quietly but insistently, at the edge of the page. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, a whole family of occult and spiritual philosophies tried to weave all these myths together into one grand story, influenced by Hindu ideas, coloured by bits and pieces of Buddhism, sprinkled with biblical imagery and Greek fragments. They proposed that humanity passes through vast evolutionary stages they called root races or world ages. In some of these systems, particularly the ones inspired by Theosophy, the claim appears very clearly that there are 7 great root races in the life of humanity on Earth, that each root race passes through its own 7 sub-races, that within each of those smaller cycles, civilizations rise, peak and collapse, leaving almost no trace. And according to several of these esoteric writers, we are living in the 5th of those root races right now, but on the 4th or 5th globe of the Earth, in the 4th or 5th Great Round, depending on whose diagram you read. Others, drawing on the same basic material but arranging it differently, conclude that humanity as a whole is already in its 7th major phase, the 7th great turn of the wheel, the 7th world to have carried beings that could call themselves human. In the 20th century, some later occultists simplified the picture even further, saying outright, "We are the 7th race," or "This is the 7th era," folding countless sub-cycles and intermediary stages into a single memorable line. Now, from a historian's perspective, these systems are not ancient in the way the Vedas or the Hopi oral traditions are ancient. They are modern constructions, attempts to synthesize and reinterpret older myths. But what matters for our quiet journey tonight is that, when these thinkers went looking across the world for patterns, when they collected Yugas and suns and worlds and ages and tried to stack them on top of each other, the number they most often settled on as the full set was 7. 7 root races, 7 rounds, 7 great days of creation, 7 seals, for those who read the Book of Revelation, 7 heavens in some branches of Islamic and Jewish thought, 7 sages, 7 chakras, 7 planetary gods wandering across the ancient sky. On the surface, these numbers might seem unrelated to the idea of previous worlds, but in symbolic thinking, 7 often marks completion, a full set, a cycle finished, with no piece missing. In that light, calling our present humanity the 7th anything isn't just counting. It's making a claim, quietly but profoundly, that we are living in a culminating age. The last bead on a string, the final day of a cosmic week. Of course, we don't have to accept that as literally true. It may be nothing more than human beings doing what we have always done, wrapping our anxieties and our hopes in numbers that feel meaningful, building elegant symbolic systems on top of stories that began around ancient fires. But there is something strangely persistent about 7. Cultures that counted their worlds differently still reserved that number for wholeness, for mystery, for endings that feel like they could also be beginnings. And when modern esoteric traditions looked at the scattered puzzle pieces of world ages and tried to declare where we are in the sequence, 7 is the place they chose to stand. So if we allow ourselves just for tonight to step into that perspective, if we imagine, as some mystics and myth-makers have done, that we really are living in the 7th great world, the 7th major civilization, the 7th round of whatever this vast experiment is, then a deeper, more unsettling question floats up beneath it like something rising slowly through dark water. If we are the 7th, what exactly was the 6th? What kind of world did it build? How far did it get? And what was happening in the last days of its existence when whatever force ends worlds finally came knocking at its door? If you go looking for an answer to that question in our oldest surviving books, one name surfaces more than any other, like a ruined city rising through mist. Atlantis. Not the pop culture Atlantis of glowing crystals and mer people. The original one. The Atlantis that appears quietly, almost casually, in the writings of a single Athenian philosopher nearly 2,500 years ago. Plato introduces Atlantis in two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. He doesn't present it as something he made up last week. Instead, he says he's passing on a story already old in his own time, a tale that came from the lawgiver Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests, who said it had been carved into their temple walls since before Greek memory began. According to that chain of voices, Atlantis was once a great maritime power, larger than Libya and Asia together, lying beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. It was a kingdom of concentric rings, land and water alternating like ripples, all centred around a sacred hill and a shining temple. Plato lingers on its wealth in a way that feels almost hypnotic. He describes metals unknown to the Greeks, including one he calls orichalcum, gleaming like red gold, lining the walls of temples. He speaks of hot and cold springs, carefully channeled, of bridges and canals, cut with geometric precision, of harbours so full of ships that the sea itself seemed crowded with masts. The Atlanteans, he says, were masters of engineering. They tamed their landscape with walls, docks, and waterways. They coordinated fleets, armies, and tribute from subject peoples all around the known world. Their island was rich in timber and metals, their fields well irrigated, their cities carefully planned. In other words, in Plato's telling, Atlantis had already done something that in his time no one had managed on a truly global scale. It had turned geography into infrastructure. It had taken the raw, wild shape of an island and wrapped it in geometry, engineering, and trade. At first, the Atlanteans are described as noble. They are said to be descended from Poseidon, an immortal woman mixing divine order with earthly practicality. For a long time they live in balance, honouring laws, practising moderation, keeping their power in check. But as their wealth and comfort increase, something begins to rot from within. Plato says that the divine portion in them started to fade, like a metal slowly losing its shine. Greed grew, ambition swelled. They began to use their power not just to maintain their world, but to dominate others. Their fleets pushed further, their armies marched wider. They tried to subdue the Mediterranean, including a young, virtuous Athens that Plato holds up as a kind of ideal. At this point in the story, the tone shifts. The gods, watching, decide that Atlantis has crossed a line. Its people have everything a civilization could want: wealth, knowledge, infrastructure, a navy that can reach across oceans, and instead of using it wisely, they reach for more. So, in a single terrible night and day, according to Plato, the island of Atlantis is shaken by earthquakes and swallowed by the sea. Its harbours, its temples, its circular canals, all vanish beneath the waves. What had been a hub of global power becomes, in his phrase, an impassable and impenetrable barrier of mud. Was that a memory? Or a metaphor? Ever since antiquity, readers have argued about it. Some of Plato's own contemporaries seem to have treated Atlantis as an allegory, a kind of moral mirror held up to imperial Athens. In this view, Atlantis isn't a historical place at all, but a warning story about what happens when a city loses its soul to luxury and conquest. Later philosophers and scholars often followed that line. They pointed out that Plato uses invented cities in other dialogues as thought experiments. They noted that his dates for Atlantis, 9,000 years before Solon, are far older than any Greek city he knew. They read the whole thing as a parable. This is what hubris looks like when you give it ships and engineers. And yet, threads of doubt have always remained. Other readers, ancient and modern, have taken Plato more literally. They note his careful geographical hints. They point out that oral traditions can stretch far beyond written history. They ask whether some memory of a real catastrophe, a drowned island, a shattered coastline, might lie beneath the philosophy. Over the past few centuries, theories have multiplied. Some researchers have looked to the island of Thera, where a volcanic eruption around 1600 BCE devastated the Minoan world. Others have suggested the flooding of the Black Sea or the sudden collapse of Bronze Age societies around 1200 BCE. Still others point to the Azores, to submerged plains off the coast of Spain, to the Doggerland Plateau that once connected Britain to Europe before it sank beneath rising seas. In each of these places, geology records real disasters: tsunamis, sudden sea level changes, coastlines torn and redrawn. And each time we find a drowned landscape, there's a quiet temptation to whisper, Atlantis. From a strict historical standpoint, we can't say that any of these is the lost island Plato described. His account is poetic, layered with symbolism, and separated from the events he narrates by thousands of supposed years and multiple chains of translation. There are no inscriptions from Atlantis, no tablets bearing its name, no unambiguous ruins that everyone agrees must be its remains. But if we loosen our grip on literalism just a little, and sit with the story in a different way, Atlantis begins to look less like a single missing island, and more like a pattern, a technologically adept maritime culture, impressive engineering, vast trade networks, high concentration of wealth, growing arrogance, expanding militarism, and then, suddenly, water as a candidate for a sixth civilization in the sense we're exploring tonight. Atlantis works best not as a solved mystery, but as a symbol. It gathers into one image all the things a world-spanning society can become, and all the ways such a society can fail. Plato may have invented the details. He may have rearranged older fragments of disaster tales into an elegant philosophical drama. Or he may have been echoing some distant, distorted memory of a real cataclysm, passed down through Egyptian priests from an age we barely know. We don't have to decide, lying here in the dark, which of those is correct. What matters for our slow journey is that when people across centuries have tried to imagine a civilization before our known line of history, when they've tried to picture what came before the ruins we can actually touch Atlantis, is the image that keeps returning. A shining ringed city, ships in every harbour, engineers carving canals into living rock, a people sure of their power, certain of their place at the top of the world. And then, in a span of hours, the sea rising over everything they had built. If there was a sixth civilization, maybe it looked nothing like Plato's Atlantis. Maybe it left traces in places we haven't yet recognized, or encoded its memory in stories we read as simple myth. Or maybe, in telling the tale of Atlantis, Plato was doing what myth makers always do, taking scattered whispers of older disasters, older falls, older lost worlds, and shaping them into a single haunting warning. This is what happens when a world forgets its limits. And if Atlantis is one such whisper, it's not alone. Other cultures have their own names, their own drowned continents and vanished lands. Names like Lemuria and Mu. Lemuria began not as a myth of golden towers, but as a problem on a Victorian map. In the mid-19th century, naturalists were trying to understand how certain animals and plants ended up where they were. Lemurs in Madagascar and India, but not in Africa in between. Strange similarities of species across vast stretches of ocean. Before plate tectonics, before the idea of drifting continents, some scientists reached for a different solution. They imagined a bridge. In 1864, the zoologist Philip Sclater proposed that there must once have been a great landmass in the Indian Ocean, connecting Madagascar, India, and perhaps other regions now separated by deep water. He called it Lemuria, after the lemurs whose distribution had sparked the question. In his view, this lost continent had since sunk beneath the waves, leaving only scattered islands behind. At first, Lemuria was a technical term, a placeholder in a scientific debate. An attempt to explain patterns in fossils and living species that didn't fit neatly into the maps of the time. It was a practical, almost dry idea. Somewhere out there, beyond the visible shorelines, there had once been more land. But as often happens with these halfway worlds between fact and speculation, the idea slipped its scientific leash and wandered into stranger territory. By the late 19th century, a new spiritual movement was spreading through Europe and America, Theosophy. Its writers were hungry for deep time, for vast cycles of human and cosmic evolution. They took up the abandoned word Lemuria and breathed a very different kind of life into it. In theosophical teachings, Lemuria was no longer just a sunken land bridge. It became the cradle of an entire root race, an early stage of humanity in a sequence of global civilizations. These Lemurians, according to the stories, were enormous, long-lived beings, more psychic than physical. Some accounts describe them as having soft, plastic bodies, third eyes, and a kind of dreamlike consciousness that barely resembled our own. Their continent, in this retelling, sprawled across what is now the Indian Ocean and parts of the Pacific, touching Australia, India, and beyond. It was said to be lush, volcanic, and eventually doomed. As the cycle turned, the tales say, Lemuria was shattered by fire and water, its peoples scattered, its last mountain peaks becoming the islands we know today. Here, the pattern begins to look familiar. A great land, a special people, an age when humans were more than they are now, closer to the gods or to cosmic forces. And then, at some appointed turning of the wheel, a catastrophe. The sea closes over another chapter. A few decades later, on the other side of the world, a British-born engineer named James Churchward added another piece to this atlas of vanished worlds. In a series of books published in the early 20th century, he claimed to reveal the story of Mu, a vast Pacific continent that, he said, had once supported a civilization of astonishing refinement. Churchward's Mu, according to his narrative, was the true motherland of humanity. A place of advanced knowledge, gentle governance, and temples aligned to the stars. He said he had learned of it from ancient tablets in India and from buried records of lost priesthoods. In his vision, Mu stretched from what is now Micronesia to Easter Island, a low, fertile land bathed in constant spring. And as with Atlantis and Lemuria, Mu's story ends the same way. A sudden series of earthquakes, the land convulsing, breaking apart, the ocean rising to swallow cities and fields. Survivors in this telling flee in ships to the Americas, to Asia, to islands that are now only the highest ridges of their drowned homeland. If you line up these three stories, Atlantis in the Atlantic, Lemuria in the Indian Ocean, Mu in the Pacific, a certain structure starts to appear. Each is placed in or beyond the great oceans that frame our maps. Each is imagined as a kind of world centre, wealthy, wise, or spiritually elevated. Each hosts a people who are either more advanced than we are, or at least different in ways that feel significant, closer to the gods, closer to nature, closer to some lost original truth. And each one falls suddenly beneath the sea. Symbolically, these continents begin to look less like separate places and more like facets of a single idea, that before our recorded history, the oceans themselves held other stories, that under the quiet surface of deep water there might lie the remains of cities, languages, and experiments in being human that ended long before our own. In the 20th century, these visions of Lemuria and Mu seeped into all kinds of pseudo-histories and popular culture. Occult writers placed secret masters in Lemurian caves beneath Mount Shasta. Novelists and pulp magazines sent explorers to rediscover Mu's wisdom. Early UFO lore sometimes merged these lost continents with visitors from the stars, suggesting that their people had not died at all, but migrated upward or inward into hidden dimensions. Even today you can find echoes of Lemuria and Mu in conspiracy theories, New Age teachings, fantasy fiction, and video games. They serve as stage sets for tales of forgotten technology, spiritual awakening, or ancient warnings. They give storytellers a ready-made backdrop, a whole world that can be anything you want it to be, as long as it ends in water. From the standpoint of modern geology, there is a quiet, steady verdict. There is no sign of entire continents in the Indian or Pacific Oceans having risen and sunk within the time frames these stories usually claim. Plate tectonics, seafloor mapping, and the long memory of rocks suggest that while sea levels have risen and fallen, while islands have emerged and vanished, nothing like a whole drowned Eurasia-sized land has disappeared in the last few 100,000 years. But lying here with the lights low, we don't have to treat that as the end of the conversation. We can hold both things at once, the firmness of the scientific map and the strange persistence of these imagined continents in our collective mind. We can notice how, again and again, humans reach for the same shape, a lost cradle, an earlier world, a civilization that had already climbed a long way up the ladder before the ocean swept it clean. Maybe Lemuria and Mu are pure invention, born from 19th and 20th century dreams, stitched from misunderstandings and the longing for origins. Maybe they are distorted reflections of real, smaller losses, islands drowned by rising seas at the end of the last ice age, coastlines reshaped in storms our ancestors could never forget. Either way, they prepare our imagination for a deeper question. If so many cultures in so many eras keep placing great experiments in civilization just over the horizon of memory, just under the surface of the sea, what might the earth itself remember, in its layers of silt and stone? To move closer to that, we have to step from myth into something harder, colder, and very real. A moment when the climate turned suddenly against our species, and the world's shorelines began to change, for reasons we can measure. A time called the Younger Dryas. The name sounds gentle. Younger Dryas, like a minor chapter in a geology textbook. A little blip at the end of the last ice age, but when you stretch the timeline out and look at how fast things changed, it starts to feel less like a blip and more like a brick wall. We're about 12,800 years ago now. The great ice sheets that had smothered North America and Northern Europe for tens of thousands of years are finally retreating. Global temperatures are climbing, glaciers are shrinking back toward the poles. Sea levels are beginning to rise, slowly, as locked-up ice melts into the oceans. For our species, this is a time of promise. In the Levant, in what is now the Middle East, small communities of hunter-gatherers known as the Natufians are starting to do something new. They're building more permanent houses, storing grain, experimenting with tending wild plants instead of just gathering them. The first fragile steps toward agriculture are appearing. In Europe, groups are following retreating glaciers, moving into fresh, open landscapes rich with game. In the Americas, humans are spreading southward, hunting enormous animals that have never known our kind before. It's not yet civilization in any modern sense, but it's a world on the cusp of change. A world where, for the first time in a very long time, the future seems to be opening up instead of closing down. And then, almost overnight in geological terms, the climate slams into reverse. Temperatures in the North Atlantic region plunge back to near Ice Age levels. In some records, the shift looks like a cliff, a sharp, sudden drop over just a few decades, maybe even less. Ice cores from Greenland show a pattern of rapid cooling. Pollen records suggest forests retreating, grasslands withering, steppe returning where woodland had begun to flourish. The warming trend simply stops, and for around 1,200 years, the planet, or at least large parts of it, slip back into a colder, drier state. This is the Younger Dryas. We still don't agree, as a species, on exactly why it happened. That uncertainty is part of what makes this period such fertile ground for speculation. One school of thought, the more traditional one, points to the melting ice sheets themselves. As the vast Laurentide ice sheet over North America decayed, enormous lakes formed along its edge. At some point, the story goes, one of these freshwater reservoirs catastrophically drained into the North Atlantic. Too much cold, fresh water too fast. The ocean circulation patterns, especially the great conveyor belt that brings warm water northward, were disrupted. The climate system, exquisitely sensitive to such changes, flipped to a new state. Another idea, more controversial, suggests that something fell out of the sky. According to what's called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, fragments of a comet or a swarm of space debris may have struck the Earth around this time. Proponents point to odd layers in the sediment record, peaks in tiny glassy spherules, melt droplets that look like they were formed at very high temperatures, bursts of platinum and other metals, traces of soot that might hint at massive wildfires sweeping entire continents. In some sites, these layers appear right at the boundary where megafauna vanish and human artifacts change dramatically. Critics argue that the evidence is patchy, inconsistent, or explainable by other means. Supporters say the pattern is too global, too abrupt, to be mere coincidence. For now, it remains an open question. A debate played out in journal articles and conference halls, while the planet above continues its quiet orbit. Whatever the trigger, the consequences were real. Across North America and other parts of the world, many of the great Ice Age animals disappear. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears. Some survive for a while in isolated pockets, but as a broad community, the megafauna are gone by the time the Younger Dryas ends. Humans, who had been hunting these animals, suddenly find their world reshaped. Food sources vanish or become unpredictable. In some regions, archaeological sites thin out. In others, tools and lifeways change rapidly, as people switch from hunting massive beasts to focusing on smaller game, fish, or plants. In the Near East, just when groups like the Natufians were experimenting with settled life, the climate turns colder and drier. Fields that were becoming reliable start to fail. Some communities seem to abandon their villages and go back to more mobile hunting and gathering. The first flirtation with agriculture is interrupted, forced to wait until the climate relaxes its grip again. To us, reading from a safe distance of 12,000 years, it can sound like a minor detour. A millennium here, a millennium there. But from inside the Younger Dryas, it must have felt like betrayal. The world that had been warming, opening, promising stability, went back on its word. For people living then, the memory might have been something like this: an age of gentle weather and abundant game, followed by sudden cold, dying animals, failing plants, fires, floods from glacial meltwater pulses, and maybe, if the impact theorists are right, things falling, burning from the heavens. Is it any wonder that later myths speak of golden ages cut short, of times when humans were closer to nature, or to the gods, until a catastrophe reset the board? Some researchers have noticed that the dates often given for certain legendary lost worlds, when you strip away the symbolic numbers, cluster suspiciously close to the Younger Dryas boundary. Atlantis, in Plato's story, is said to have fallen around 9,000 years before Solon, which, when converted into our calendar, lands somewhere in the loose neighbourhood of this climactic upheaval. Other traditions, far from Greece, hint at an age before the Great Cold returned, when the seasons were gentle and the animals larger. These could be coincidences, they could be poetic reconstructions or misreadings of much later events. But for those who dream of a sixth civilization before our own, the Younger Dryas is a magnet. If there had been a sophisticated culture flourishing on the coasts, at the river mouths on low plains made fertile by stable climates, this is exactly the kind of event that would have destroyed it. Rapid cooling, chaotic weather, sea levels first surging locally from glacial outburst floods, then rising globally as the Ice Age finally ends. Shorelines moved hundreds of kilometers. Anything built too close to the edge would be drowned, shredded by waves, buried under silt. Most archaeologists are cautious here. The further back we go, the thinner the evidence becomes, and the more careful we have to be about filling gaps with stories. There is, so far, no clear, unambiguous proof of cities or writing or metalwork from before the Younger Dryas. No skyscrapers under the Antarctic ice. No global grid of buried power lines. But there are puzzles. Out-of-place dates. Early constructions that seem to appear suddenly, fully formed, just after the climate stabilizes again. Myths from widely separated cultures that remember a time of abundance before a sudden punishing change. And sitting in the middle of all this is that cold, sharp interval from about 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, when the world paused and shivered before warming again. When the Younger Dryas finally ended, temperatures shot up with astonishing speed. In Greenland ice cores it looks like a step change, a sudden jump from glacial chill to near modern warmth over just a few decades. This is the moment when the last great ice sheets collapse back. Sea levels rise more quickly. The outlines of our modern coastlines begin to emerge. If you're searching for a plausible window in which an earlier, relatively advanced culture could have grown along now drowned shores, and then been shattered by a combination of sudden cold, flooding and rising seas, this is the window that glows on the timeline. It doesn't prove that such a civilization existed. It simply shows that the Earth, in very recent geological history, has already put us through the kind of global catastrophe that could erase most traces of one. As we drift forward into the next part of the story, keep that in mind. A real measured upheaval at the end of the last ice age, a time when climates swung, seas climbed, and human societies had to reinvent themselves. Because just as the Younger Dryas is ending, and the world is warming for good, something appears on a hilltop in what is now southeastern Turkey. Something built in stone on a scale that doesn't quite fit our old timelines. A place called Göbekli Tepe. When the story of Göbekli Tepe first reached the wider world, it sounded almost like a misprint. A mound on a dusty hilltop in southeastern Turkey, long thought to be just another archaeological bump on the landscape. Local farmers ploughed around it. Shepherds grazed their flocks over it. Pottery shards turned up here and there, nothing unusual for a region that has been lived in for thousands of years. In the 1960s, a brief survey noted some carved stones, but they were dismissed as the tops of medieval graves, the kind of thing you record in a notebook and move on from. It wasn't until the 1990s when the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt returned to the site and started looking more closely that the illusion cracked. Those gravestones weren't gravestones. They were the tips of massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing 10, 20, even 50 tons. When digging began in earnest, circular and oval enclosures emerged from the soil. Stone circles ringed with pillars, with two larger monoliths standing in the centre like silent guardians. And then came the dates. Radiocarbon analysis of the layers associated with the earliest enclosures suggested an age of around 11,600 years before present, right at the end of the Younger Dryas, long before the pyramids. Long before Stonehenge, long before cities, writing bronze, or even fully developed farming. According to the standard story we all learned in school, the sequence is supposed to go like this. First agriculture, then villages, then surplus food, then specialists, then temples and monumental architecture. But Göbekli Tepe seems to flip that script. Here we have enormous carved stone pillars, arranged in carefully planned circles, decorated with intricate reliefs of animals. Foxes, snakes, boars, birds, wild cattle, human-like figures with arms hinted along the sides, belts and loincloths etched into the stone. A whole symbolic world frozen in limestone. And the people who built this, as far as we can tell, were still hunter-gatherers. No domesticated wheat yet, no widespread use of pottery, no evidence of permanent housing right on the hilltop itself. Groups seem to have gathered here seasonally, perhaps travelling from surrounding regions to participate in rituals we can only guess at. This is why Göbekli Tepe makes so many timelines wobble. It suggests that the impulse to build something huge and sacred, something that gathers people together under a shared sky, may have come before fields of grain and fenced animals. That religion or ceremony or shared myth might have been the magnet that pulled scattered bands into something more like a society. Some archaeologists now talk about temples before cities. Others are more cautious, reminding us that our sample is still tiny, that we may simply be missing the everyday structures that went with these circles. But even with caution, it's hard to ignore how sophisticated the site is. Quarrying, shaping, transporting, and erecting multi-ton pillars requires planning, coordination, and a pool of labour that isn't hunting or foraging every waking hour. The carvings show a mastery of symbolic representation. The layout of the enclosures hints at geometry, at an understanding of space and orientation. It's as if a piece of high architecture has fallen into a time when, by our old models, only simple camps and huts should exist. This is where people who dream of earlier worlds start to lean in. Some researchers suggest that Göbekli Tepe might not be the beginning of something, but a survivor, a memory written in stone by the descendants of people who had already lost more than we can see. In that view, the hunters and gatherers on this hilltop are not inventing complexity from nothing. They are preserving fragments of older knowledge about stoneworking, about sacred imagery, about aligning structures with the heavens that drifted through the Younger Dryas like embers carried on the wind. It's a speculative idea. There is no clear, direct line from a vanished sixth civilization to these pillars. But the timing is suggestive. Göbekli Tepe rises just as the climate stabilizes after a long, harsh interval, just as ice sheets retreat for the last time, just as sea levels settle into something like their modern rhythm. If there had been societies along ancient shorelines washed away by floods and meltwater pulses during the Younger Dryas, their survivors would have moved inland, uphill to higher ground. A limestone ridge overlooking a broad plain would be a natural place to gather, to remember, to start again. And then there is the strangest detail of all. Göbekli Tepe was buried, not by some later landslide, not by the slow drift of centuries of wind-blown dust alone, but as most excavators now argue, deliberately. The enclosures were filled in with rubble, stone chips, animal bones and debris over time, layer after layer. The circles were entombed. This wasn't casual abandonment. It looks more like a planned closure, a decision to hide, to put away, to finish a chapter. Why would a community go to the enormous effort of building ring after ring of megaliths, only to slowly pack them back into the hill? One possibility is simple ritual. Perhaps each enclosure had a life cycle. It was built, used for generations, then formally killed by filling it, making room for new structures higher up. A sacred layering of time. Others have wondered if there was fear involved, if something about the site or the era made people decide that what was known here should be sealed off, that certain images, certain arrangements belonged to a past that needed to stay buried. In the softer corners of the sixth civilization idea, Göbekli Tepe becomes a kind of time capsule, a stone echo of knowledge that once ran along coasts now underwater, a deliberate act of preservation and concealment by people who had heard, perhaps only in stories, what happens when the world shifts too fast. We can't yet know which of these stories is closest to the truth. The site is only a fraction excavated. Most of the hill is still untouched, sleeping under its own backfilled earth. Each season brings new carvings, new alignments, new questions. But whether we see it as the first flowering of complex society after the ice, or as a late echo of something older, Göbekli Tepe sits at a crossroads in our narrative. Right on the far side of the Younger Dryas, right at the moment when the planet calms down and humans begin to imagine more than survival. A temple before agriculture, or perhaps a monument built by people who were not quite as simple as we once believed. People standing between worlds, one world that had just ended, and another whose shape they could only dimly see. From that hilltop of circles and buried pillars, our path leads outward to other stones that don't quite fit, to weathered faces and eroded walls that some say remember an older reign. On the Giza plateau, the stone remembers a different kind of reign. Everyone knows the outline of the scene, the Great Pyramid rising like a frozen ray of sunlight, the Nile spreading out beyond, and, crouched at the edge of the desert, the lion-bodied, human-headed guardian we call the Great Sphinx. In the standard timeline, the Sphinx is a child of the Old Kingdom, carved, according to most Egyptologists, around 4,500 years ago, during the reign of the pharaoh Khafra, whose pyramid stands just behind it. In this view, workers cut the body of the Sphinx straight out of the natural limestone bedrock, then used some of the quarried blocks to build nearby temples. The face, though weathered, is taken to be that of the king himself. It's an elegant story. It ties the Sphinx into a neat package with the pyramids and the causeways. One great Fourth Dynasty building project under a single royal master plan. But then, in the 1990s, another illusion began to crack. A small group of researchers, among them the American writer John Anthony West and the geologist Robert Schoch, started looking less at the face and more at the body. Less at the famous profile, more at the weathering on the enclosure walls around it. To their eyes, something was off. The limestone walls surrounding the Sphinx showed deep, rounded channels and vertical undulations, the kind of soft, scooped erosion you see in landscapes that have endured long, steady rainfall, not the crisp, sand-blasted pitting typically left by wind in a desert. Schoch, trained to read rock like a diary, suggested that this pattern looked more like the work of water than of sand and wind alone. Prolonged heavy rain, the kind of climate Egypt hasn't seen for thousands of years. If that's true, the Sphinx would have to be older than the Sahara as we know it, perhaps pushed back to a wetter period at the end of the last ice age. 10, even 12,000 years ago, back toward the time of Göbekli Tepe, back toward the fading edge of the Younger Dryas. Not everyone agrees. Most Egyptologists argue that you don't need an Ice Age rainstorm to explain the weathering. They point out that different layers of limestone erode at different rates, creating irregular profiles. They remind us that the Sphinx sat for millennia in a shallow pit that trapped humidity, floodwater from rare Nile overflows, even salt crystallization. All these, they say, can create rounded vertical weathering over a mere few thousand years. They also lean on context. Around the Sphinx they see a cluster of Fourth Dynasty monuments, the Sphinx Temple, the Valley Temple, the pyramids themselves. They see consistent building techniques, matching stone courses, similar styles of masonry. To them, it looks like a single cultural moment, not a patchwork of ages. The debate has only sharpened the questions. If the water erosion hypothesis has even a grain of truth, then either our climate reconstructions for Giza are missing something, or the core of the Sphinx, its body, perhaps even its original head, might predate dynastic Egypt entirely. Some researchers who favour an older Sphinx suggest that the current human face is a reworking. They point to its relatively small proportions compared to the body and to hints of earlier features beneath later carving. In their telling, an already ancient lion or lioness statue facing due east toward the rising sun was recut in the Old Kingdom into the likeness of a king. Others go further, imagining that the Sphinx began as a monument from a pre-dynastic, maybe even pre-Neolithic culture. A relic of people who lived in a greener Sahara, who watched a different Nile, who might have witnessed the end of a previous age. If that was so, the implications would ripple outward. An older Sphinx would hint at large-scale stoneworking in northeastern Africa long before the textbook birth of Egyptian civilization. It would suggest that the skills to carve a 70-metre-long guardian from bedrock and to shape megalithic blocks for the flanking temples did not appear from nowhere in the 4th dynasty, but were inherited, borrowed, or rediscovered from a much deeper well of experience. In the softer versions of the 6th civilization idea, the Sphinx becomes less a royal portrait and more a memory marker, a survivor of earlier hands, adopted by later kings, repurposed to fit a new story. The way a sacred hill or spring might carry one layer of myth after another, while the stone and water themselves are far older than any name we give them. Skepticism is healthy here. The majority of specialists still favour the conventional dating. The evidence for a truly Ice Age Sphinx is suggestive rather than conclusive. Erosion can be tricky to read. Human reworking can blur older lines. And the desert, quiet as it seems, is always rearranging its own record, but the questions remain stubborn as bedrock. Why does the weathering around the Sphinx look so different from nearby structures of unquestioned Old Kingdom age? Why do some of the oldest stone temples at Giza, built with enormous, roughly fitted blocks, look in some ways more primitive or more archaic than later finer work? Why does the Sphinx enclosure feel, even to cautious eyes, like something that doesn't entirely belong to the phase around it? Whether the answer lies in climate quirks, in unseen phases of local history, or in echoes of a culture we have not yet fully recognized, the Sphinx sits at another crossroads in our story, a lion in stone facing the dawn, its body scored by forces we're still arguing about. It may be no more than the greatest sculpture of the Old Kingdom, or it may be one more whisper from a deeper past, one more hint that by the time the civilizations we know stepped onto the stage, someone else had already been building and had already stopped. From Giza's weathered guardian, the path leads on to other stones that strain belief, to platforms and blocks so massive that even our machines would struggle to lift them. High in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, another set of stones waits in the dark. Baalbek, in the official story, is a Roman city, a place of grand temples to Jupiter, Bacchus and Venus, a showcase of imperial ambition on the eastern fringe of the empire. You can walk there today among colonnades and stairways, inscriptions and carved capitals, and it all feels comfortably at home in the first centuries after Christ. But beneath those columns the ground tells a stranger tale. The temple platform of Baalbek rests on foundations that seem almost out of scale with everything built on top of them. At the western edge of the Great Terrace, 3 enormous blocks, known as the Trilithon, sit in the wall like embedded ships. Each is around 19 metres long, weighing perhaps 800 tons or more. Above them and beside them, lesser stones are still huge by ordinary standards. Yet the Romans, for all their engineering genius, never left us a clear explanation of how, or even why, such blocks were used here. And then, just outside the main complex, the mystery deepens. In the ancient quarry, half joined to the bedrock and half freed from it, lies the so-called Stone of the Pregnant Woman, a single limestone block, over 20 meters in length, weighing in the neighborhood of 1,000 tons by most estimates. Nearby, another colossus, even larger, was discovered in recent years beneath the soil. These are not foundation stones that made it into place. These are attempts interrupted. Someone at some time had the intention of cutting, shaping, and moving blocks far larger than the already gigantic stones we see in the trilithon. Workmen carefully undercut the monolith, smoothed its surfaces, prepared it for transport. And then, for reasons we do not fully understand, they stopped. The conventional view is that this someone was simply the same Roman project that raised the temple above. In this telling, the quarry blocks are over-ambitious orders abandoned when engineers realized that flaws in the stone or changes in the plan made them unnecessary. Perhaps the temple platform was completed without them. Perhaps a new emperor shifted resources elsewhere. History is full of halted projects and half-finished monuments. Others, though, see a more layered story at Baalbek. Some archaeologists and alternative researchers have suggested that the lowest courses of the platform walls, including the trilithon, may predate the Roman phase. They note differences in masonry style. The oldest stones are Cyclopean in scale, tightly fitted, with minimal use of mortar. Above them, later builders used smaller, more manageable blocks, more typical of Roman technique. To some eyes, it looks as though the empire found an already ancient terrace and crowned it with its own temples. Local tradition adds its own flavour. Medieval legends spoke of giants who built Baalbek, or of a primordial king who raised it as a fortress before the flood. In some versions, even Solomon appears, commanding spirits to move the stones. These stories do not give us dates, but they hint at a long memory of the place as older than any written chronicle. Then there is the practical question that keeps people awake at night, unless they are listening to history to fall asleep. How do you move an 800 or 1,000-ton block over uneven ground, with no steel cranes, no diesel engines, no modern bearings? Engineers have proposed ramps of earth, teams of hundreds or thousands with ropes and rollers, carefully timed leverage using wooden frames and lubricated sledges. Experiments with smaller but still massive stones have shown that with patience and organisation, remarkable things are possible. Yet even the generous reconstructions often admit that Baalbek pushes the limits. The margin for error shrinks as the stones grow. A crack, a tilt, a misjudged support, and centuries of effort could lie broken in the dust. Which brings us back to those unfinished giants in the quarry. The fact that they remain half-cut, half-ready, is itself a kind of evidence. It suggests a project mid-stride, a vision for a platform, or perhaps an expansion of it that was never fully realized. Maybe the Romans did the quarrying, then ran out of will or money or time. Maybe a much older culture began the terrace in some distant age, and later civilizations merely built over the scars of its abandoned plans. In the softer versions of the lost civilization idea, Baalbek becomes another frozen moment. A snapshot of a building program interrupted. A staircase that was meant to rise higher, a platform that was supposed to extend further, using stones even larger than those already in place. If the sixth civilization once walked this earth, some imagine that Baalbek might have been one of its projects. A high terrace under a changing sky, a ritual centre or observatory or fortress begun with almost unimaginable stones. Then suddenly work stops, climate shifts, trade routes fail. A catastrophe strikes. The builders vanish, and the next culture to find the site inherits only the foundations and a puzzle. Whether that is myth or memory, metaphor or history, the pattern is the same. At Baalbek, as at other ancient sites, we see not just completed temples, but halted intentions. Lines of effort that simply end in mid-stroke. And Baalbek is not alone. Across an ocean, on a high Andean plain, another set of stones waits with similar questions, cut and shaped with astonishing precision, yet scattered as if some great work was suddenly abandoned. On the Altiplano of Bolivia, 10,500 feet above sea level, those questions rise again. Puma Punku is not large in the way Baalbek is large. There are no towering columns, no intact facades. If you walk there today, what you see at first glance is a field of ruins. Blocks tipped over, fragments half buried, carved stones lying like dice thrown across the earth. And then you look closer. Many of the blocks at Puma Punku are cut with a precision that feels, to some visitors, almost out of place in the ancient world. Faces of stone that are startlingly flat, edges that run straight for meters. Right angles that, even weathered by centuries of wind and sun, still meet as if traced by a machinist's square. The most famous pieces are the so-called H-blocks, medium-sized and roughly similar in shape. They are carved with a series of recesses, grooves and notches that repeat from one stone to another. When you compare them, you can see a kind of modular design. Projections here, insets there, all seemingly planned so that, in some form or arrangement, they would interlock and support one another in 3 dimensions. Engineers who have examined them note the complexity of these profiles. Not just simple slots, but stepped channels, rounded inner corners, and carefully spaced ledges, as though the stones were meant to accept metal clamps, wooden beams, or other stones in a very specific configuration. Some surfaces appear to have been finished so smoothly that, under magnification, the tool marks are hard to discern. Mainstream archaeology maintains that the builders were the Tiwanaku culture, flourishing in this region, roughly between 500 and 1000 CE. In this view, Puma Punku was part of a large ceremonial complex, an important ritual and political centre on the Andean plateau. The stones are andesite and red sandstone, workable with the copper tools, hammerstones, abrasives, and patience available to a sophisticated pre-Inca civilization. Experimental archaeologists have proposed methods. Hard stone hammers to rough out the blocks, sand and water used as an abrasive with wooden guides to grind flat planes. Repeated measuring with simple sighting tools to create straight lines and right angles. With organized labor and enough time, they argue, what we see at Puma Punku is extraordinary, but not impossible. Others are less convinced. Some researchers and enthusiasts point to the crispness of the cuts, the regularity of the repeated forms and the intricate interior right angles carved into recessed areas. They suggest that replicating such features with stone and copper tools alone would be extremely difficult. Measurements made by surveyors have revealed tolerances that, in places, approach what we would expect from modern machine work. From this, more speculative theories grow. In these tellings, Puma Punku is not just a Tiwanaku temple annex, but a fragment of something much older. Perhaps reused, perhaps repaired. Some suggest that the most precise blocks belong to an earlier phase, a legacy from an unknown culture whose stonemasonry exceeded anything we comfortably attribute to the Bronze or early Iron Age. The question of tools becomes central. If there were harder chisels, perhaps of meteorite iron, they have not been found. If there were advanced abrasives or lathes or straight edges of a quality we no longer expect from that time, they have not survived in the record. So we are left with the stones themselves, arguing silently for methods we can only infer. Then there is the state of the site. Unlike a neatly ruined temple, where fallen walls still suggest their former shape, Puma Punku looks almost exploded. Massive blocks lie at odd angles, as if tossed. Some appear to have been snapped or sheared, not slowly eroded. Earthen platforms are torn open, foundations exposed. Whatever structures once stood here, they are no longer merely collapsed, they are scattered. Conventional explanations point to earthquakes, subsidence, and the long, patient work of human reuse. People have been quarrying ancient sites for building material for thousands of years. A terrace collapses, a wall leans, later inhabitants pull blocks for their own houses, leaving a jumble where there was once order. More adventurous narratives imagine something faster. A cataclysmic event, a great flood washing across the Altiplano, a shockwave from a distant impact, or a seismic convulsion far beyond what the Andean plateau usually remembers. In such stories, Puma Punku becomes a symbol of interruption, a carefully fitted stone machine suddenly smashed and left in pieces. The question of age adds another layer. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from nearby structures supports a Tiwanaku horizon. The mainstream timeline places the complex within the last 2,000 years. Yet some fringe researchers point to astronomical alignments and erosion patterns, and argue for a far older origin, perhaps reaching back into the late Pleistocene, closer to the end of the Younger Dryas. In that alternative frame, Puma Punku could be a hand-me-down, begun by one culture, reoccupied and modified by another, and finally overtaken by the Tiwanaku people, who built around and upon what they found. The most enigmatic blocks with their interlocking geometries would then be relics of an earlier vision, a design language partially understood, partially lost. As for purpose, the debates echo those at Baalbek, a ceremonial platform aligned to the heavens, a palace for elites who drew their authority from control of water and agriculture on the high plain. A kind of three-dimensional puzzle in stone, engineered to hold wooden superstructures, coloured panels or metal fittings that have long since vanished. Or in the more speculative accounts, a node in a global network of megalithic sites, each encoding knowledge in the language of geometry and proportion. Whatever its original role, one thing is clear. When we meet Puma Punku, we meet it mid-sentence. The stones are speaking a grammar of precision and interlock, but the building they once composed is gone. We see modules without the finished machine, letters scattered without the page that once held the story together. And here, the pattern we have been tracing becomes harder to ignore. At Baalbek, unfinished giants sleep in a quarry. At Puma Punku, precisely cut blocks lie toppled and separated, as if a careful construction program was interrupted and never resumed. Around the world in different ages and under different skies, we glimpse this same motif. Projects begun with ambition and skill, then abandoned or shattered before the vision could be fully realized. If there was a sixth civilization, some imagined that its last works might look exactly like this in our time. Not intact cities, but isolated puzzles, foundations without their superstructures. Precision without explanation, and Puma Punku is not the only Andean mystery that feels this way. Just beyond it, curling above the city of Cusco, another fortress of stone waits in the thin air, its walls flowing like waves, its blocks locked in place with a confidence that has yet to be duplicated. Sacsayhuamán sits on a ridge above Cusco, high enough that the air feels thin, close enough that you can look down on the old Inca capital as if from a balcony. From that height, the fortress doesn't look like a castle in the European sense. There are no towers with battlements, no keep rising above the rest. What you notice instead, even from a distance, are the lines. 3 great zigzagging terraces of stone stacked one above the other like frozen lightning laid gently across the hillside. Walk closer, and those lines resolve into blocks. Some of the stones in the lower walls of Sacsayhuamán are among the largest ever used in construction anywhere on Earth. Individual blocks weighing maybe 50, 100, even more tons by some estimates. They are not neat rectangles, they are polygons, each face cut to meet the shapes around it. 12-sided, 14-sided, all locked together in an intricate jigsaw of grey andesite. And yet in the joints between them there is nothing. No mortar, no cement, just stone pressed against stone so tightly that, in many places, a knife blade will not pass between the blocks. The surfaces where they meet are subtly curved and beveled, like two cupped hands fitting together. Each stone has been shaped to the unique forms of its neighbours, not just above and below, but to the sides, sometimes hooking behind or under them in ways you can only see when a block is missing. Engineers who study these walls talk about load paths and seismic resistance. In a land of earthquakes, the polygonal design makes sense. The interlocking shapes distribute stress, allowing the walls to flex and settle without falling. The broader bases, tapering upwards, give stability. The inward-leaning faces resist overturning. From a structural perspective, Sacsayhuamán looks like the work of people who understood their restless ground very well. Mainstream archaeology credits the Inca with this understanding. According to Spanish chronicles, thousands of labourers were conscripted to build these walls in the 15th century, using stone retrieved from nearby quarries. Ramps of earth and timber, teams of people with ropes, copper and stone tools to shape the blocks, decades of organised imperial effort to raise a fortress above the capital. In this telling, Sacsayhuamán is the crown of Inca masonry. Powerful but late, impressive, but fully within the capabilities of a complex state that could marshal vast amounts of labour. But the stories told in the Andes are older. Quechua traditions remember Sacsayhuamán as the work of beings or ancestors endowed with greater strength, or as a project that began in an age before the Inca and was later taken over and completed. Some versions speak of earlier peoples who softened stone, making it malleable like clay. Others simply insist that the most massive blocks predate the empire, whose banners the Spaniards saw. A few researchers pick up these threads and suggest a layered history. They point to differences in stonework, the largest, tightest-fitting polygonal blocks at the base, then slightly smaller, more regular stones above them, and finally rougher, more obvious repair work in the higher courses and adjoining structures. In this view, the oldest stones might represent a phase of construction that goes back well before the known Inca expansion, perhaps incorporating foundations from a culture we barely remember. When people compare Sacsayhuamán to other megalithic sites, certain echoes emerge. The way the gigantic blocks sit in the lowest courses recalls the megalithic first layer pattern some see at Baalbek. The earthquake-resistant polygonal technique appears in different forms in the older walls of places like Machu Picchu, Ollantaytambo, and at sites across the Mediterranean. The sheer scale of some individual stones invites comparison to the trilithons, or to the unfinished giants still sleeping in quarries around the world. And beneath all these comparisons runs the same quiet question: how? Not in a mystical sense, but in the concrete, practical one. How do you move a 100-ton block across uneven ground and set it into a wall that must fit it so precisely? Ramps and rollers have been proposed, ropes made from strong plant fibres, carefully organised teams coordinating each pull. Experimental archaeologists have shown that surprising feats are possible with such methods, given enough people and time. Yet some aspects remain elusive. The way the stones dovetail in 3 dimensions suggests planning beyond simple trial and error. The absence of chisel marks in certain joints raises questions about finishing techniques. The consistent tightness of the fit over large areas feels, to many who visit, like an achievement that still hovers just beyond easy explanation. Sacsayhuamán, like Puma Punku, sits at the intersection of what we can reconstruct and what we can only imagine. On one hand, we have an empire we know existed, leaving behind roads, terraces, storehouses, and chronicles of labour levies. On the other, we have oral traditions of earlier builders, unmatched blocks that seem almost over-engineered for their purpose, and a style of stonework so confident that it has survived centuries of earthquakes with barely a crack. Some see in these walls the handwriting of a lost school of engineering, perhaps inherited from cultures that endured older cataclysms on the Andean plateau. In that more speculative frame, the lower courses of Sacsayhuamán might be a surviving paragraph from the 6th Civilization's manual on how to build in a dangerous world, copied, reused, and extended by later hands. Whether we accept that or not, the pattern they embody is familiar now. Again and again we encounter works that feel almost excessive in their precision and ambition. Multi-ton stones fitted with a care that seems to exceed the needs of the moment. Techniques that, while not impossible, still hum with a kind of mystery when we try to reproduce them. Sacsayhuamán stands above Cusco like a memory made solid. A fortress, a symbol, and perhaps in some deeper way, another piece of evidence that someone before us knew more about stone, stress, and the trembling of the earth than our usual timelines are quite comfortable with. From here, our path curves back across the ocean, towards structures whose shapes are more familiar, but whose age and purpose may also be whispering a different story than the one we like to tell. From the high stones of the Andes, the journey back across the ocean brings us to a landscape that feels almost over-familiar. The Giza plateau, sand, a dark line of the Nile, and those 3 shapes every schoolchild can sketch with their eyes closed. 3 triangles on the horizon, 3 pyramids. The mainstream story here is simple and, in many ways, elegant. According to Egyptologists, the Great Pyramid of Khufu, the slightly smaller Pyramid of Khafre, and the Third Pyramid of Menkaure were all built in the 4th dynasty, around 4,500 years ago. They are seen as the culmination of a clear architectural evolution that starts with simple mastabas, moves through the step pyramid at Saqqara, then experiments its way up to the smooth-sided giants we know today. We have quarry marks with Khufu's name inside the Great Pyramid, worker cemeteries, traces of planned villages that housed the labour crews, hieroglyphic references to pyramid-building projects. When you add it together, the consensus view feels solid. These are Old Kingdom monuments raised by dynastic Egyptians at the height of their power. But around the edges of that picture, other possibilities have gathered. Some researchers quietly suggest that the Giza complex might be more like Sacsayhuamán or Baalbek, a layered site, a place where later pharaohs added casing stones, temples and inscriptions onto a much older core they did not entirely understand. In this alternative frame, Khufu and his successors are not the original architects, but the renovators, the inheritors of something already ancient in their time. One line of argument comes from geology. People who study stone and weathering have long debated the condition of the Giza structures. The pyramids themselves, clad for most of their history in polished limestone, do not tell an easy weathering story, because much of that casing is gone. But around them, the bedrock and surrounding features do. We met this puzzle briefly with the Sphinx and its enclosure walls, where some geologists see patterns of rounded, vertical erosion they associate with heavy, long-term rainfall rather than mere wind and sand. If that interpretation is correct, it would push at least part of the Giza landscape back into a time when Egypt was wetter, perhaps before 7,000 or 8,000 BCE, well before the accepted beginning of dynastic civilization. Applied cautiously to the pyramids, this idea suggests that the platforms, foundation trenches, and perhaps inner cores could be remnants of earlier construction phases adapted by later builders. A stone inheritance from people who lived on a greener Nile. Another line of reasoning looks not down at the rock, but up at the sky. Some researchers notice that the three main pyramids seem to echo the offset pattern of the three stars in Orion's belt. They argue that if you simulate the night sky going back thousands of years, the best match between the pyramid layout and Orion's belt occurs not in 2500 BCE, but in an earlier epoch, around 10,000 or 11,000 BCE, when the Nile would also have aligned differently with certain celestial markers. From this astronomical perspective, the Giza Plateau becomes a star map, keyed to a sky that belongs to an age we do not normally associate with stone architecture at all. Mainstream scholars remain unconvinced. They point out that star pattern correlations are easy to see once you start looking for them, that erosion can be subtle and variable, that written and archaeological evidence overwhelmingly supports a 4th dynasty origin for the major pyramid structures. In their view, there is no need to invoke a lost epoch of engineers to explain Giza. The known Egyptians, with their organization, religious motivation, and access to labor, are more than capable. And yet, the inheritance idea lingers. If you imagine that the earliest core structures at Giza were started in a different climate regime, perhaps by a culture already experimenting with large-scale stonework, and that later pharaohs adopted, finished, and rebranded them as royal tombs, certain oddities soften into place. The precision of the base levelling, the almost excessive accuracy of the cardinal alignments. The way the Great Pyramid's internal passages seem to encode angles and proportions that don't strictly need to be there for burial purposes alone. Features that feel to some eyes like the continuation of a project whose original intent may have drifted out of memory. In that more speculative light, the Giza pyramids become not just monuments of the 4th dynasty, but the final chapters of a longer story. A story in which an earlier culture, perhaps surviving the end of the last ice age, began something on this plateau. A design, a plan, a message in stone. Then time, climate, and catastrophe intervened. Centuries or millennia later, the rising civilization we call Egypt found these vast, unfinished forms on their sacred west bank, and did what humans have always done with impressive ruins. They claimed them, repurposed them, completed them in their own image. If there was a 6th civilization, cautious voices might say, the Giza Plateau would be exactly the kind of place where its traces could hide in plain sight. A project started under one sky, finished under another. A relay baton passed across a forgotten boundary in time, from one age of builders to the next, and now resting silently in the dark, waiting for us to decide which story we are willing to hear. If we stay on the Giza Plateau a little longer, and let our eyes adjust to that other direction the story wants us to look, the sky begins to take over from the sand. The specific idea that pulled Giza into the stars is often called the Orion correlation theory. In its simplest form, it says this: the 3 Great Pyramids are a deliberate ground plan of the 3 stars in Orion's belt. Al-Nitak, Al-Nilam, Mintaka, 3 points in the sky, 3 points on the earth, matched not just in number but in their slightly uneven spacing, and in the way the faintest of the trio sits a little off the straight line. On a clear winter night, if you've ever watched Orion rise, you know how striking that belt is. For many cultures, Orion has been a hunter, a warrior, a giant. For the ancient Egyptians, the constellation was bound up with Osiris, lord of the dead, and rebirth, ruler of the afterlife. A god you might well want to mirror in stone if you were building eternal monuments on the edge of the desert. According to the correlation theory that mirroring goes deeper than symbolism, proponents suggest that if you freeze the sky and slide it back through time, allowing for the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, there is a particular epoch when Orion's belt sits in just the right orientation over Giza, and the Milky Way crosses the land roughly where the Nile flows. In that reconstruction, the plateau becomes part of a larger celestial diagram. Pyramids for stars, river for galaxy, heaven stamped onto Earth. The key to that backward slide in the sky is something called the precession of the equinoxes. Earth does not spin like a perfectly balanced top. Over roughly 26,000 years, its axis traces a slow circle in space, tilting the planet very slightly first one way, then another. Because of this motion, the backdrop of stars behind our seasons drifts. The point where the sun rises on the spring equinox moves gradually through the zodiac. Polaris has not always been our North Star and will not be forever. Ancient astronomers who watched patiently could notice this. But there is a catch. The changes are very small in a single lifetime. To recognize precession, you need records across generations, or a culture so stable that observation is handed down and refined over centuries. Possibly millennia. Some researchers believe this is exactly what we are glimpsing at Giza and at a few other ancient sites. They argue that the pyramid layout, the angles of certain internal shafts that appear to aim at specific stars in Orion and nearby constellations, and the way these alignments only make precise sense at dates long before 2500 BCE, all point to a tradition of sky watching that stretches back into the deep past. Not just we know where north is, but we know that north itself moves, and we are marking where it once stood. In this speculative reading, the builders weren't only constructing tombs. They were encoding a date stamp in architecture, tying the monument to a particular configuration of the heavens in a cycle that takes tens of thousands of years to repeat. A message written in the language of precession. Mainstream scholars look at the same data and see something more modest. Yes, the pyramids are very well aligned to the cardinal directions. Yes, some of the narrow shafts point in the general direction of important stars for the religion of the time. But from their point of view, you do not need a 26,000-year astronomical canon to explain that. If a culture reveres Osiris in Orion, it is natural to tilt passages toward his region of the sky. If you are burying a king you hope will join the imperishable stars, you might aim architectural features at where those stars rise or culminate during his reign. When it comes to matching the three pyramids to Orion's belt at a specific date like 10,500 BCE, critics argue that the fit is not as exact as advertised, that similar correlations can be found between many sets of 3 points if you're allowed to rotate and scale at will, and that texts and inscriptions from the Old Kingdom do not speak of preserving knowledge of precession. From this perspective, the Orion correlation is an attractive pattern emerging from our tendency to project order onto the sky. And yet, the presence of precession in ancient myths and systems elsewhere keeps the question alive. In later traditions like Hellenistic astrology and some strands of Indian and Mesopotamian lore, you find hints of a great year, an immense cycle in which the equinox point travels through all 12 signs. Some zodiacal schemes subdivide history into ages ruled by different constellations. The idea that the heavens move very slowly and that this movement can be tracked seems to appear in multiple places already mature. If any culture on the Nile was truly tracking such long cycles, it would imply something profound about their continuity. A people who measure time not just in years or dynasties but in precessional ages are thinking on a scale where the rise and fall of kingdoms becomes a brief flicker. To notice that the sky of your own childhood is fractionally different from the one described in the most ancient star hymns, you must inherit observations from a very long-lived tradition. That is where the notion of a predecessor civilization quietly slips back in. If the Orion correlation, or anything like it, really is a relic of precise precessional astronomy, then either the 4th dynasty Egyptians themselves maintained a scientific tradition stretching far back into the Ice Age, or they were carefully replicating and reusing a template they found, a pattern of stone and star handed down from an earlier cycle of human organization. In that light, the pyramids are no longer just royal tombs or symbols of centralized power. They become bookmarks in a much older book, page markers left by someone who understood that worlds come and go, ice advances and retreats, rivers shift course, and yet the slow turning of the sky endures. If our species has walked this path more than once, if there really was a sixth civilization capable of reading and writing in the language of the heavens, then aligning stone to Orion would be one of the few ways they could speak across the flood of time. A quiet reminder, looming over the desert night after night, that others have watched this same constellation rise, and that their story, like ours, was written under a turning sky. If you follow that thought a little further, the sky and the stone begin to blur into something else. Not just architecture, not just astronomy, a worldview. In many ancient systems, the heavens are not a backdrop. They are a clock, a calendar, and a conscience. When a star rises where it did in the first time, it isn't just an astronomical event. It's a reminder that this has all happened before. Ages unfold, reach a peak, decline, and end. Then something washes the slate clean, which is where the sixth world, the sixth civilization, quietly approaches its last chapter. If they were truly watching precession, tracking the slow drift of the equinox point across constellations, then they would have noticed that the sky itself predicted change. Not overnight, not in a single bad harvest, but in long arcs. Eons of stability, then hinge points where everything becomes unstable. Sea levels climbing, ice shelves collapsing, rain belts sliding north or south. The familiar pattern of seasons starting to wobble. To later cultures inheriting only fragments of this knowledge, it would not have looked like orbital mechanics. It would have looked like judgment. Many myths say exactly that. They speak of a time when human beings became arrogant, or forgetful, or cruel, and the powers that rule the world decided to start over. The heavens shift, and with them the world below. The old age drowns, and a new one rises from the water. We are about to step into those stories, but before we sink into the flood myths themselves, there is one small thing to mention, while your mind is still hovering between stone and stars. If you find your curiosity waking up even as your eyelids grow heavy, we've gathered many of these threads into a book. It's a slow, meandering walk through prehistoric secrets, from genetic bottlenecks and vanished coastlines to sky temples and submerged ruins, to the question of how many times humanity might have climbed this ladder before. We look more closely at places we've only glanced at here, the terraces and cut blocks of South America, the eerie precision of sites like Baalbek and Puma Punku, the pillar forests of Göbekli Tepe, animal-faced gods staring out of the world's first known temple. We spend time with the Sphinx and its weather-worn enclosure, with star maps, calendars of stone, and the possibility that someone long before us was already counting down to an ending they saw on the horizon. The book doesn't claim certainty. It lays out the mainstream view, the fringe interpretations, and the legends that sit uncomfortably between them, and lets you drift among them at your own pace, the way we are doing now. If this kind of quiet wandering is your favourite way to fall asleep, you might enjoy having it on a bedside table. If you'd like to explore it, it's available at sleepytimehistory.com, and for this week we've made it gently cheaper, a small discount as a thank you for wandering this far into deep time with us. If not, that's perfectly fine. You can just let the words wash over you and stay right here in the story, because the story is about to step into water. When later civilizations looked back toward their own hazy beginnings, the moment that loomed largest was almost never a fire, or an earthquake, or a slow drought. It was a flood, a wall of water, a sea that used to be far away suddenly at the door. Rains that do not stop, rivers that forget their banks and wander across whole plains. Islands swallowed, coasts redrawn, For our hypothetical sixth civilization perched along shorelines that are now more than 100 meters under the modern sea, such an ending would not have been metaphorical. It would have been lived. Entire cities, if they had them, could vanish in a generation or two. Harbours where ships once gathered would become fishing grounds. Sacred sites aligned to the solstice sunrise could find themselves far out beyond the surf. Their descendants, scrambling inland, carrying scraps of memory, would tell and retell the story of the rising waters. Over centuries, details would blur. The reasons would shift. Perhaps it had been human pride, perhaps a quarrel among the gods, perhaps simply the way things go when an age is done. By the time those stories reached the first literate kingdoms we know by name, they had hardened into myth. Myths of a world before the water came, myths of a great cleansing that ended an age, myths of survivors in boats and on mountain tops, watching a drowned landscape settle into its new shape as the seventh world began. If you listen carefully to those myths, scattered across continents and millennia, they begin to sound like different versions of the same dream. In Mesopotamia, along the rivers where cities first rise in brick and bitumen, the story is written down on clay. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods decide that humans have become too noisy, too many. They send a flood to wipe the world clean. One man, Utnapishtim, is warned. He builds a boat, seals it with pitch, loads it with his family and the seed of all living things. The waters rise, the world disappears, and for days his boat rides on a sea without landmarks. When the flood finally begins to sink back, he sends out birds to look for land. A dove returns, a swallow returns, a raven does not. He knows then that somewhere the peaks are out of the water again. He steps out onto a mountain, makes an offering, and the new age begins. In another tradition, written much later, but sharing the same valley, the names are different, but the pattern is familiar. In the book of Genesis, the earth is filled with violence and corruption. God decides to start over. Noah is told to build an ark, enormous and unlikely, and to bring aboard his family and pairs of animals. The fountains of the deep burst forth, the windows of heaven open, and for 40 days and nights the rain does not stop. Again the boat drifts over a drowned world. Again a bird is sent out and returns with news of a shrinking sea. Again landfall on a mountain, an altar, a promise that this kind of ending will not happen exactly this way again. Move the scene thousands of miles west, to the highlands and jungles of Mesoamerica, and the language changes, but the rhythm persists. In the Popol Vuh, sacred book of the Quiche Maya, there are attempts at making humans in successive ages. Mud people, then wooden people, who fail to honour their makers. One of the punishments is a flood of resin, a deluge that drowns the unworthy. In some versions, the wooden people are scattered, transformed into monkeys, echoes of a failed humanity living on in altered form. Among the Aztec, who spoke of suns instead of worlds, one of the previous ages is called the Sun of Water. It ends when the gods send a flood that drowns almost everyone. The survivors, according to the story, become fish. Travel farther south to the Andean world and you find Viracocha, a creator god who, tired of his first race of giants, unleashes a great flood to wipe them out. He then shapes a new, smaller humanity and sends them out from caves and lakes to people the mountains and coasts. Far away in time and space in India, there is Manu, warned by a talking fish that a flood is coming. He builds a boat, ties it to the horn of that fish, and is guided through the rising waters until they subside. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a god, sent deluge in a chest, coming to rest on a mountain, and repopulating the world by casting stones over their shoulders. On Pacific islands, where the horizon is nothing but water, There are stories of a time when the ocean climbed higher, swallowing low-lying lands. In some Polynesian myth cycles, a great wave or prolonged storm covers ancestral homelands, forcing people to set out in canoes, never to return. In parts of northern Australia, Aboriginal songlines speak of the old shores, now far offshore, and of the sea coming in to fill what are now bays and gulfs. Individually, any one of these tales could be explained away as coincidence, as the natural anxiety of river people and coastal people translated into story. Floods are common. Rivers do change course. Storm surges can erase villages in a day. Human minds everywhere tend to put endings in the language of what scares them most. But when you stack the stories side by side, their shared bones become hard to ignore. A world gone wrong or grown noisy, a decision from beyond to wipe the slate. A chosen or lucky survivor warned in advance. A vessel, often a boat, sometimes a chest or floating house. Waters that cover the familiar world, a landing on a high place. A sacrifice, a covenant, a new beginning. Some researchers look at this pattern and see more than metaphor. They point to real events in Earth's recent past that could have seeded such memories. At the end of the last ice age, as the great ice sheets melted, sea level did not rise in a smooth, gentle line. There were pulses, periods when vast glacial lakes, dammed behind walls of ice, suddenly overtopped or broke through. In a matter of days or weeks, entire valleys could have filled with water. Coastlines that had crept landward by meters over centuries might lurch inland by kilometers. Geologists talk about events like the draining of Lake Agassiz, a freshwater sea that once sat over much of North America. When its outlet changed, huge volumes of water poured into the North Atlantic, raising sea levels and disrupting climate. In Eurasia, there is evidence that the Black Sea may have been a smaller, isolated lake before Mediterranean waters rushed in, perhaps catastrophically, flooding coastal settlements and redefining the region. Along every continental shelf there are now submerged river valleys and deltas that would have been habitable plains when sea level was lower. A people living there, watching the ocean inch closer across generations, would already have been telling nervous stories. If those plains were finally taken not inch by inch but in great surges, those stories would harden into legend. Once we lived where the waves are now. Once there were gardens and temples and cities out where the fishing grounds lie. Then the water rose. Our imagined sixth civilization, if it clustered along those ice age shorelines, would have experienced such changes not as background geology but as apocalypse. The great meltwater pulses would not be numbers on a graph. They would be the day the harbour vanished, the month the sacred island went under, the year when everyone finally had to leave their descendants, clinging to hillsides and inland refuges, might remember the details for a while. The strange colour of the sky, the way the sea roared for days, the date in their calendar when the first wall collapsed. But over centuries, those specifics blur, and the framework remains. The gods were angry, the age was over, a flood came. A few survived to start anew. Some scholars are cautious about tying all of this together. They point out that floods are among the most common natural disasters, and that any society living near water will almost inevitably tell flood stories. They note that in many traditions the deluge serves as a moral lesson more than a weather report, a way of talking about ethical reset rather than coastal erosion. From this perspective, the similarities are less evidence of a single ancient event, and more a reflection of shared human psychology. Others go further, suggesting that myths can arise independently, yet converge on familiar shapes, because our minds are built in similar ways. We understand time in terms of cycles. We think in terms of cleansing and renewal. We fear drowning. Put those ingredients together, they say, and you will get flood myths wherever people have rivers and rain. And that may be all it is. Or, as some more adventurous thinkers propose, those recurring patterns might be the worn-down edges of a real shared memory. A long, slow environmental crisis punctuated by sudden, terrifying surges. A sixth civilization that grew up along the margins of the Ice Age seas, learned enough to watch the skies and track the turning ages, and then watched its own foundations go under, its knowledge scattered with its people, its history reduced to a handful of phrases: the world before the water, the great flood, the few who survived. Whatever the true origin, the pattern that emerges is the same one we have seen again and again in this long, sleepy walk through deep time. A rise, a flowering, a shock from the outside, knowledge lost, survivors scattered, memory mythologized. By the time we meet these stories in carved tablets and sacred books, the sixth world, if it ever existed, is already long gone. What remains are whispers of an ending echoed in different languages, all saying in their own way, there was once another world. It drowned. We are what came after. If there really was a world before the waters, you might expect that now and then, when the sea is calm and the light is right, a fragment of it would show itself again. Divers off the coast of Yonaguni, a small island in Japan's Ryukyu chain, say that's exactly what happens. The story goes that in the mid-1980s, a local diver looking for new sites descended along a rocky point and saw something that didn't feel like ordinary seabed. At about 25 meters down, the sand falls away and a massive stone structure seems to rise out of the dim blue. Terraces, broad and flat, steps high and regular, sharp 90-degree corners that look at first glance like the foundations of a drowned city. They call it the Yonaguni Monument. It's huge, roughly the size of several football fields, and it looks uncannily like architecture. There are what appear to be platforms, long corridors, even something that has been described as a kind of grand stairway, rising in tight geometric layers toward where the shoreline would have been thousands of years ago. Some researchers, standing on boats above or finning slowly past those edges, suggest that this is evidence of human construction from a time when sea level was much lower. According to that line of thought, the structure might once have stood on dry land, perhaps as a ceremonial centre or fortress, only to be submerged as the post-Ice Age seas climbed more than 100 meters. In this telling, Yonaguni becomes a literal sunken ruin, a stone echo of some forgotten coastal culture. Others see something different. Geologists familiar with the sandstone and mudstone of the region point out that the rocks there are naturally layered and fracture along straight plains. They argue that currents, earthquakes, and ordinary erosion can produce ledges, blocks, and step-like patterns without any human hand at work. To them, the monument is a beautiful example of nature's geometry, made more mysterious by our tendency to see patterns and buildings in anything that looks too regular. The debates can get technical. People argue about tool marks, about supposed carvings, about alignments with ancient coastlines and star positions. Photographs from different angles seem to support different sides. In the end, lying in the dark water above those tiers, listening to your own breath in your ears, you are left with a feeling more than a conclusion. It could be an ancient platform, it could be a clever trick of stone and time. It is, either way, a place where the question of earlier worlds becomes strangely tangible. Half a planet away, in the shallow turquoise waters off Bimini in the Bahamas, there is another such question. Here, the sea is warm and clear. Just a few meters down, a long, linear formation of stone blocks stretches across the sandy bottom. From above, it looks like a road or a harbour wall, or the edge of some gigantic toppled structure. It has been called the Bimini Road or the Bimini Wall, And for some, it is the missing piece in a much older puzzle, the legend of Atlantis. Decades before its discovery, the American mystic Edgar Cayce spoke of a portion of Atlantis rising near Bimini in the late 1960s. When divers then found this curious line of stones in 1968, the coincidence was irresistible. Authors and enthusiasts began to link the two, suggesting that the Bimini Road might be the remains of Atlantean cays, breakwaters or causeways, overwhelmed when that earlier world went under. More cautious voices offer simpler explanations. Marine geologists note that the stones are beach rock, a type of natural cemented sand common in the Bahamas. As shorelines shift and waves work on them, these slabs can crack into rectangular pieces and slip off in long, straight runs that mimic human handiwork. They point to similar formations elsewhere that no one claims as ruins. So Bimini, like Yonaguni, sits in that grey zone between what looks artificial and what can be produced by natural processes over thousands of years. No inscriptions, no pottery, no clear cultural material have yet emerged to anchor either site firmly in human history. What we have are shapes, suggestions, and stories. Around the world, people have begun to catalogue other such underwater curiosities. Off the coast of India, near the Gulf of Khambat, sonar surveys have mapped patterns on the seabed that some interpret as the outlines of submerged settlements, though the data are contested and the currents there make excavation difficult. Near Malta, divers explore deep cut ruts carved into limestone on land, and then follow rumours of similar tracks disappearing beneath the waves. Along the coasts of Cuba, Portugal, and the North Sea, scattered sonar images and fishermen's tales hint at walls, streets, or standing stones now resting far below the surface. Each new claim brings with it the same cycle: excitement, grand theories, skeptical analyses, and then often a quiet fading into the background when clear evidence proves elusive. Yet taken together they sketch the edges of a simple, sober fact about our recent past. At the height of the last ice age, so much water was locked up in continental ice sheets that global sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than they are now. Entire shelves that are now underwater were dry land. Broad coastal plains extended far out from the present shorelines. River valleys ran where shipping lanes run today. Any people living then, especially if they favoured rich, low-lying deltas and bays as most coastal societies do, would have built their camps, villages, perhaps even towns, in places that are now under tens of meters of water. As the climate warmed and the ice melted, the sea did not politely stop at some convenient boundary. It moved inland, step by step, pulse by pulse, drowning those ancient coasts. Whatever structures stood there, stone, wood, or mud brick, would have been battered by waves, collapsed by storms, and slowly buried in silt. After 10 or 12,000 years of this, what remains might not look like a city in the way we expect. It might look like odd terraces of rock, a suspiciously straight road on the seabed, a scatter of worked stones mixed into a natural reef. For those who dream of a sixth civilization, Yonaguni, Bimini, and the other contested sites are like glints of something at the bottom of a deep pool. They are tantalizing physical hints that our known story might not be complete. But they are also, at least for now, inconclusive. There is no smoking gun ruin, no undeniable colonnade rising from the abyss. Only formations that sit at the threshold of our pattern-seeking minds, inviting us to wonder. Perhaps as our tools improve and more of the continental shelves are mapped and explored, clearer answers will emerge. Perhaps the next generation of sonar images will reveal unmistakable streets and courtyards. Or perhaps we will mostly find what we have been finding so far: long drowned river channels, ordinary rocks in extraordinary arrangements, and the quiet reminder that 90% of the places our Ice Age ancestors might have called home are now hidden beneath the waves. For now, these sunken shapes keep a kind of watch at the boundary between memory and geology. They whisper possibilities but refuse to settle into certainty. They leave open the door to an earlier world without quite letting us step through. If the sea hides most of the places where an earlier civilization might have lived, museums and storerooms sometimes hold something else it might have left behind. Not whole cities, just small, stubborn objects that don't quite fit where they are supposed to. On a quiet stretch of Mediterranean seabed in the early 20th century, sponge divers stumbled across a Roman-era shipwreck near a little Greek island called Antikythera. Among the statues and amphorae and corroded bronze was a lump of greenish metal that looked, at first, like nothing much at all. Only decades later, when someone thought to X-ray it, did its true shape begin to show. Inside that encrusted mass was a nest of gears, not just a few, but dozens, stacked and meshed in delicate arrangements. Some with teeth so fine they might have come from a 19th century clockmaker, not from the ancient world. As researchers studied the fragments, an astonishing picture emerged. The Antikythera mechanism, as it came to be known, appeared to be a kind of analog computer, designed to model the motions of the sun, the moon, and possibly the known planets. Turn a crank, and little pointers would move across engraved dials, predicting eclipses and mapping cycles in the sky. Nothing else like it has survived from that time. The Greeks wrote about complex devices, and we know they were gifted mathematicians, but the precision engineering required to cut those gears seemed, for a while, to arrive out of nowhere and then vanish again. Some people look at the mechanism and see a remnant. They wonder whether it was a late copy of something older, taught and retaught through generations from a more technical age that had already passed away. Most historians see it differently. For them, the mechanism is a pinnacle of Hellenistic science, produced by a small circle of skilled artisans and scholars pushing known techniques to their limit. In this view, it doesn't need a lost civilization behind it. It only needs a fragile chain of transmission that later broke, as libraries burned and specialized craft traditions faded. But even in that sober telling, the feeling remains the same. Human beings once knew how to do this here, and then for a very long time did not. Far from the bright Aegean, in the soil of modern-day Iraq, another small puzzle turned up. Excavations in the 1930s uncovered a ceramic jar with a copper cylinder inside, and within that an iron rod. When replicas of this Baghdad battery were filled with an acidic liquid, they produced a faint electrical current. That simple trick was enough to spark a flood of speculation. Some writers imagined workshops humming with low-voltage devices, artisans electroplating jewellery with a technique history had forgotten. Others pictured healers experimenting with mild electric shocks. The idea that people 2,000 years ago might have harnessed electricity, even on a small scale, was so startling that it quickly spread into popular culture. More cautious voices pointed out that jars, copper sleeves, and iron rods are all perfectly ordinary things in that setting. The devices might have been containers for scrolls or ritual objects, or something as simple as storage for papyrus, dipped in vinegar. The ability to make a weak battery in a lab does not prove that ancient people used them that way. Still, the pieces fit just well enough to keep the question open. Did someone, somewhere along the line, notice that certain combinations of metals and liquids could produce a tingle? Did they play with that flicker of power only for the experiment to end with them? On the walls of the Hathor temple at Dendera in Egypt, another kind of suggestion has been carved into stone. In a crypt beneath the complex reliefs show human figures holding long bulb-shaped objects with what looks to some eyes like a thick cable leading back to a box. Supporters of alternative history theories have called these the Dendera lights, and see in them a representation of electric lamps. maybe even powered by something like the Baghdad battery. It is an evocative image, priests tending glowing glass under painted ceilings, a play of light and sacred symbol preserved as a secret tradition. Mainstream Egyptology offers a quieter explanation. The bulbs, they say, are stylized lotus flowers from which serpents called Djed or Serep emerge, representing aspects of creation and divine power. The box at the base is not a generator but a pedestal, and the whole scene is a mythological tableau, not a technical drawing. Ancient artists, after all, were not engineers. They were storytellers working in a visual language that can be hard for us to read. In each of these cases there is a pattern, a device that seems ahead of its time, a set of materials that could, under the right conditions, do something more than we expect, a carving whose shape brushes up against a modern machine. For those inclined to see cycles of rise and fall, they can look like scattered, surviving hints that knowledge is not a straight line upward from ignorance to understanding, but a tide that advances and retreats, leaving behind strange shells on the shore. For others, they are reminders of something closer to home, that even within a single known civilization, skills can be gained, refined, and then forgotten. That a few generations of disrupted teaching are enough to sever very sophisticated chains of practice. Whether we decide these are echoes of a truly older sixth world, or simply the high notes of our own uneven story, they prepare the mind for a larger question. If such traces can linger from the recent past, what might a whole earlier civilization have been trying to leave for us? One way to approach that question is to look again at all those stones we've walked past in this story. The circles, the terraces, the stepped platforms, the carved blocks that do not seem to care whether anyone is there to admire them or not. They are patient in a way that wood and cloth and paper are not. They wait. Some researchers have suggested that this might not be an accident. If you lived in a world that had ended once or nearly ended, if your grandparents still told stories about fire from the sky or rising seas, or a winter that never seemed to stop, you might start to think about time differently. Not as a smooth road stretching out in front of you, but as a loop that could close again at any moment. In that mindset, building in stone is not just about worship or status or beauty. It is about durability, about saying something in a language that can survive wind and rain and the slow forgetting of human voices. Modern archaeologists sometimes talk about monumentality as a kind of social technology, a way to organize labor, to signal power, to knit a community together around a shared project. But others, especially those drawn to cycles and lost ages, imagine an additional purpose layered underneath. They look at places like Göbekli Tepe, at the great trilithons of Baalbek, at the carved lion bodies and water-worn stones on the Giza plateau, and wonder, were these meant to be read by strangers? Not neighbours from the next valley, but people so far in the future that even the makers' languages would be gone. If you wanted to talk to a distant future, you would have to plan for catastrophe. Floods, fires, earthquakes, glaciers grinding over everything you know. Clay tablets would not be enough. Anything made of metal might be melted down by whoever came next. Even carvings on cliffs could be eroded away, so you would choose the thickest blocks you could move. You would fit them together so tightly that roots and frost could not easily pry them apart. You would spread your message across multiple sites, on different continents if you could, in the hope that at least one would endure. In this view, the megaliths become something like a network of stone time capsules, not filled with objects but with patterns, alignments to stars and solstices that might survive where words do not, ratios and geometric relationships that might hint to some future skywatcher or number lover that whoever built these things knew more than we assumed. Of course there is a gentler, more familiar reading, that people built in stone because it was impressive, because it made myths tangible, because it turned the invisible order of the cosmos into something you could walk around and touch. Those explanations do not require a sixth civilization whispering to a seventh. And yet, there is another little pattern that keeps returning. Some of the most massive ancient projects are unfinished. At Baalbek, gigantic blocks still lie partly detached in the quarry, their sides squared, their bottoms never fully cut loose. At certain pyramid fields, foundations are laid out and then abandoned, partial causeways leading nowhere. On windswept hilltops, half-raised stone circles give way abruptly to bare ground, as if the workers simply stopped coming one season and never returned. The standard explanations are reasonable. Political change, economic strain, a ruling dynasty that fell out of power, a source of labour that dried up, a shift in religious fashion that made an old project seem less urgent. History is full of cathedrals that were never finished, of skyscrapers halted at a steel skeleton by a market crash. Still, for those who think in cycles, these abandoned stones take on a different, slightly haunting colour. They begin to look like the last sentences of a letter that was never completed. The final attempts of a culture that could feel its own foundations shaking, trying to get something heavy and meaningful into place before the next turning of the wheel. We can see a strange parallel in our own time. Deep in the deserts of the American Southwest, and in other proposed sites around the world, modern committees have quietly wrestled with a problem that would be instantly recognizable to any ancient monument builder. How do you warn people 10,000 years from now not to dig into buried nuclear waste? Our languages will likely be gone. Our symbols may be meaningless. A skull and crossbones could be taken for a religious icon, or a badge of bravery. So architects and semioticians and anthropologists have proposed vast earthworks, fields of jagged stone, arrangements of spikes and mounds designed to feel ominous, even to someone with no shared culture, a kind of engineered dread written in shape and scale rather than in words. The documents describing these projects read in places like science fiction. But at their core is a deeply human impulse. We have made something dangerous that will outlast us, and we want to protect whoever comes after, even if we will never meet them, even if they will never know our names. If you turn back to the ancient world with that in mind, the old stones begin to glow with a different sort of emotion. Imagine a group of builders on a high plateau, measuring out the base of a temple that aligns with a particular star that once blazed in the dawn sky. They know from careful watching that the star is moving, slowly, that the heavens change on a cycle so long it cannot fit into a single life. Perhaps, in their myths, that great turning is linked to floods and fires. Perhaps they believe that when the sky returns to this configuration again, danger will return with it. What do you do with that belief if you have no metal presses, no digital archives, no way to bottle your warning except in stories and stone? You might encode your knowledge in the orientation of your buildings. You might carve animals into pillars to mark constellations tied to particular ages of the world. You might repeat a certain angle, a certain proportion over and over, hoping that a curious mind in some later age will feel that repetition and begin to ask why. Is that really what they were doing? We do not know. The mainstream view is more cautious, tying alignments to ritual calendars, to agricultural needs, to the simple human desire to mirror the sky on the ground. The idea of deliberate technical messages for the far future remains, at best, an unprovable speculation. But it is a speculation that touches something soft in us, because to imagine them trying to reach us is also to imagine that they were thinking about us. Not us personally, of course, but the idea of future people who might walk the same hills, drink from the same rivers, and look up at the same changing constellations. It suggests a continuity of concern that stretches across collapses and dark ages and forgotten scripts. We do the same, in our own quieter ways. Time capsules buried under schools, records stored on gold plates sent out beyond the solar system, archives sealed in salt mines for readers we will never meet. Each is a little assertion that what we have learned matters enough to try to carry it across the gaps. So when you lie there and picture the half-cut stones in an ancient quarry, or the weathered faces of statues staring out over empty plains, you can, if you like, add one more layer to the story. Not only were they building for gods or for kings, or for the pleasure of seeing something immense rise out of the earth. Perhaps in some small way they were building for us, or for whoever would come after them, in the seventh world or the eighth or the ninth. A stone against forgetting, a pattern against the next flood. A warning we are still learning how to read. If you step back from all these scattered warnings, another kind of pattern begins to emerge. Not in stone this time, but in story. Across the myths and theories we've touched, civilizations fall for three great reasons, repeated like drumbeats under different names. Sometimes the world ends because the sky itself turns against you. Fire, ice, water, a comet in the Younger Dryas hypothesis. A sudden freeze that kills the mammoths and drowns the mammoth hunters beneath advancing ice. In these tellings, humans are small, almost incidental. The planet shrugs, and whatever was built on its surface is swept away. Sometimes the world ends because humans become too large in their own eyes. Atlantis is the clearest example. Plato's island doesn't just sink, it is sunk as a judgment. Not for ignorance, but for pride. A people who once lived simply begin to love power, luxury, conquest. The gods, or perhaps the moral fabric of the cosmos itself, will not allow that imbalance to stand. The sea comes in, not as an accident, but as a correction. And sometimes the world ends as a kind of moral weather, a storm of behaviour. The global flood traditions tend to read this way. In Mesopotamia, in the Hebrew Bible, in the stories of the Americas and the Pacific, humans grow violent or corrupt or forgetful of sacred obligations. There is no mention of orbital mechanics or impact craters. The cause is described as character, not climate. The waters rise because people have gone wrong. Cataclysm, hubris, war, and cruelty. Three slightly different lenses for the same dark glass. If you place them side by side, a strange thing happens. Each age doesn't just end, it ends with a lesson attached to its ruins. Atlantis, do not let your cleverness run ahead of your wisdom. The flood, remember that how you treat each other matters to the structure of the world. The Younger Dryas. Even if you behave perfectly, nature can still turn on a dime, so build with that in mind. It is possible, of course, that this is only how human storytellers process chaos. A glacier advances, a coastline rearranges itself, a city falls to an invading army, and the survivors reach for meaning. They weave causation into coincidence, sewing moral threads through random fabric. In that view, the pattern is in us, not in history. But there is another way to look at it. Perhaps these recurring endings are not purely invented morals pasted on after the fact, but fragments of memory laid down again and again. Maybe a fishing village really did watch the sea climb higher every year. Maybe traders really did see summer after summer ruined by a cold ash-filled sky. Maybe a proud city really did collapse under the weight of its own expansion, and leave behind nothing but a ring of barren soil and a cautionary tale. If that happened once, even in small local ways, people would talk about it. Parents would warn their children, don't live only on the shoreline, the sea forgets its boundaries. Don't anger the gods with cruelty, cruelty breeds enemies. Don't assume the good weather will last, the world has other moods. Tell that story long enough and it becomes a myth of cycles. Tell it across thousands of years and it starts to sound like a law. And there is yet another layer. We seem to be oddly comforted by these loops of destruction and renewal. The idea of a single, final, unrepeatable end is hard to look at, but an age that falls and makes room for another, that feels in a way like breathing. In, out, golden age, collapse, dark age, recovery. If the world has ended 6 times before in fire or in water or in the invisible realm of meaning, then our own troubles become part of a familiar rhythm. Not an exception, but a verse in an old song. As we move toward the last part of our journey, keep that in mind. The stories of Atlantis, of the flood, of sudden winters and vanishing coasts may or may not point to a single lost 6th civilization. They may be reflections, echoes, refractions of many smaller endings stitched together. But whether literal or symbolic, they keep circling the same quiet question. In every age, something was being built when the wheel turned. Temples, canals, observatories, stories. If we really are the 7th world in a long, spiralling sequence, then somewhere out beyond our own horizon, another turning waits. Before we drift in that direction, toward our lights and our towers and the things we are raising right now, it might be worth pausing just for a moment to ask, what exactly are we in the middle of building here at the edge of our own age? If those older worlds were busy with their observatories and waterworks when the sky changed, we are no different. We are also in the middle of projects so large that it's hard to see them while we live inside them. We are building cities first of all, not the handful of stone enclosures or hilltop fortresses that marked earlier ages, but continuous carpets of human habitat. From orbit, our greatest mega-project is simple to describe, a lace of light wrapped around the dark side of the Earth. Roads, suburbs, industrial zones, apartment towers. Hundreds of millions of separate decisions about where to live and work, slowly knitting themselves into something that behaves almost like a single organism. You can think of it as one vast branching structure with air and power and food circulating endlessly through its veins. If someone in a far future age were to dig through our strata, that might be the most obvious trace. Thick layers of concrete and steel, foundations of buildings so large that their footprints cover entire hillsides. They might find the cores of skyscrapers still standing like fossilized tree trunks, their glass long gone, their upper stories collapsed, but their bases fused to the bedrock. We are also wrapping the planet in metal, communication cables laid across ocean floors in lines so long they might read as purposeful geometry to any distant observer. A swarm of satellites ringing the Earth, blinking quietly in vacuum. Weather satellites, navigation satellites, telescopes, communication relays, thousands of small machines, all performing tiny acts of measurement and transmission that, together, make up a nervous system for the planet. If our age were to end abruptly, most of those satellites would fall slowly back into the atmosphere and burn, leaving only a faint sprinkling of exotic metals in the soil. But some might be nudged outward, stranded in high orbits so stable that they circle for millions of years. To whatever consciousness might one day climb high enough to see them, they would look like an inexplicable ring of relics, all from the same moment, all speaking a language of silicon and gold. Beneath the satellites, and inside the cities, we are building something more elusive, archives made of light. Almost everything we know, every map, every law code, every picture of every ruined temple from earlier ages, is being translated into patterns in magnetic domains and memory chips. We are compressing our world into an invisible lattice of zeros and ones. If the electricity stops, these archives vanish in an instant. But if some fragments survive hardened storage in deep bunkers, or insulated vaults forgotten under collapsing universities, they might be the strangest fossils of all. Tiny black rectangles that, to the right kind of tool, unfold into oceans of language, images, and sound. A whole civilization's inner monologue frozen and waiting. At the same time, there are a few projects we have built deliberately for eyes we do not expect to meet. High on a cold island near the Arctic, under layers of rock and concrete, sits the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. It is a simple idea, a backup copy of the world's plants. Wheat, rice, maize, wild relatives of crops you will never see in a supermarket, all sealed in foil packets, in boxes, in chambers chilled far below freezing. The vault is meant as insurance against smaller, more ordinary disasters, war, climate shifts, local crop failures. But if a distant future culture stumbled on it with no context, it might seem like a ritual structure. Shelves and shelves of carefully labelled life stored in darkness, as if someone expected the fields outside to disappear and wanted to be sure they could be replanted. Far beyond Svalbard, farther than any city or satellite, 2 thin gold plates are currently drifting in interstellar space. They are bolted to the sides of the Voyager spacecraft, which left Earth in 1977. On their surfaces are grooves that encode music, greetings in many languages, the sound of waves and wind and heartbeat, and a map of where our sun is in relation to certain pulsars. The odds that anyone will ever find those records are effectively zero. Space is too large, time is too wide, and yet they exist, because some of us felt that if a message could be sent to the dark, it should be. Perhaps that is another hallmark of a late age, the impulse to speak across not only distance but epochs. To imagine a listener who might not be human, might not even be biological, but who might still care that at one point, on a small blue planet, there were beings who listened to bark and crickets and rain. If you look at all of this together, cities, satellites, digital libraries, seed vaults, wandering records, you can see different answers to the same question. How do we continue? Continue food, continue knowledge, continue memory. Continue the feeling of being heard, even if the listener only exists in imagination. But built into these same systems are our vulnerabilities. Our cities depend on long, fragile lines of supply. Our satellites orbit in belts of debris that could, in theory, cascade into storms of shrapnel. Our digital archives depend on constant maintenance, on power and cooling and the patience of technicians. Even the seed vault relies on the stability of permafrost that is beginning to soften. If the 6th civilization, whatever it was, disappeared under water or ice or its own excesses, then we are also balanced on edges. Climate, biodiversity, weapons whose destructive power we have only tested in small, horrifying samples, economic webs so tangled that a failure in one corner ripples across the globe in hours. None of this is certain doom. It is simply the shape of our current age, immense capability, immense interconnection, and a growing awareness that those same qualities can magnify both mistakes and misfortunes. So we might ask in a quiet voice, as we fall asleep under the glow of distant cities, when some future archaeologist, human or otherwise, peels back the layers of our time, what will they think we were trying to do? Will they see only extraction and waste, or will they notice the careful packets of seeds, the little gold records, the attempts to weave global agreements out of fear and hope? Will they understand that beneath the noise and conflict, there were also people who planted trees whose shade they would never sit in, who tried to write laws to protect forests they would never visit, who sent messages into a silence they would never hear answered? In the old stories, every age is given a chance to learn something before the wheel turns. Maybe our lesson, if there is one, lies somewhere in what we are choosing to build now, and what we are willing to risk to protect it. And if we really are the 7th civilization in a long, mysterious sequence, then everything we raise, towers and networks and quiet vaults of seeds and songs, may become the whispering ruins that the eighth world one day tries to interpret. For them, we are the lost age. For us, we are only halfway through our own story, looking up from the work of building and wondering how long the ground beneath us will stay still. So we end up here, at the edge of a long circle of ideas. We have walked through stories of golden ages and sacred numbers, through Atlantean islands and drowned plateaus, through temples that seem to arrive before their supposed time, and stones cut so cleanly that they still make our fingers itch with questions. We have listened to legends of floods that reset the world, and looked at scars in ice and ocean that some researchers think might be their real, cold counterparts. We have stood in imagination beside the builders of Göbekli Tepe, the carvers of Sphinx and Puma Punku and Sacsayhuamán, wondering what kind of counting they were doing with stars and seasons and cycles. Along the way we have played gently with one idea, that before us there may have been others, not necessarily a single glittering global empire, but perhaps a sequence of rising and falling cultures, each one learning how far you can push a climate, a forest, a food web, a technology, and each one leaving more questions than answers in stone and story. If there was a sixth civilization, or a fifth, or a fourth we have forgotten, we do not yet know what they were building when their time grew short. Maybe it was flood control systems or star tracking observatories. Maybe it was myths, the safest container they could find, pouring warnings into tales of angry gods and lost ages, hoping some faint outline would survive even when their walls did not. What they left unfinished might not be a tower or a canal, but a lesson about limits. A half-told story about what happens when ingenuity runs faster than wisdom. We are still trying to hear it properly. As you lie here at the end of this journey, you are part of that hearing. Every question you carry forward, every quiet decision you make about what should endure and what can gently end, becomes another small echo for whoever comes next. If you found this slow walk through ruins and possibilities comforting, or thought-provoking in a soft, sleepward way, you can help us continue it. When you wake, or if you're still awake now, feel free to tap like, or subscribe, or leave a comment. Those simple signals tell the strange machinery of the present that there is room in the world for calm, careful history. And if your eyes are still open, I would love to know once more where you are listening from. A city high in an apartment tower, a quiet village, a dorm room, a night shift break room, a cabin in the dark. Those scattered points of light, all hearing the same story, feel a little like our own gentle constellation. If the mysteries of earlier ages have wrapped around you tonight, you might also enjoy the book we've made about them, a deeper dive into these prehistoric secrets. You can find it, when you're ready, at sleepytimehistory.com. For now, though, there is nothing you need to do. The questions will still be here tomorrow. The ruins are not going anywhere. The stars will keep their slow paths. Let your attention loosen. Let the images of stone and sea and distant fires fade to the edge of your thoughts. Somewhere, long ahead of us, another world may be listening for our traces. Tonight it is enough simply to rest in this one. May your sleep be deep, your dreams curious and gentle, and may you wake with just enough wonder to carry a small piece of these old echoes into your day.